taught him the sailor's craft and personally invited him on this voyage to the edge of the known world. And in return, Christian has taken his ship and is about to load Bligh and his loyalists on a boat and cut them adrift in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Practically a death sentence. Now, why these friends turned into enemies is far from clear, even centuries later. But what is certain is that this moment is the start of one of the most infamous episodes in all of naval history. A story of exploration and endurance, of personal drama, exploitation, and a deadly manhunt in uncharted waters. This, my history-loving friends, is the tale of the mutiny on the Bounty. This tale of high seas betrayal is brought to you by Ground News, whose service would have been super helpful had it existed during the time of Bounty. December 23rd, 1787, Spithead, England, 16 months earlier. The HMS Bounty clears port, embarking on a voyage of scientific endeavor, discovery, and commerce. A mission to collect unfamiliar plants in the newly explored Pacific and use them to feed an empire. A voyage to a place so remote at the time that the only modern equivalent would be a mission to space. And on the quarterdeck stands William Bligh, with his new voyage beginning much later than anticipated. See, the HMS Bounty had left Greenwich on October 5th at nursery. Right you are, Zoe. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a step back. See, the American Revolution had created a major problem for the British Empire. Much of English manufacturing consisted of the textile trade, which was dependent on cheap cotton imports from the American South. But now that America was no longer a colony subject to price controls, imperial thinkers had decided to make the British West Indies the new site for cheap cotton cultivation. Though converting the Caribbean to cotton production would mean expanding its population of enslaved Africans. More people meant a greater need for food, but that was already proven. Because local staples like plantain and maize were vulnerable to hurricanes. And when America revolted, the disruption of food imports also caused a hunger crisis. But Joseph Banks, the naturalist who had accompanied Captain Cook, had a solution. Tahitian breadfruit. It was hardy, it required practically no tending, and it gave 3 crops a year. I mean, come on. So that was William Bligh's mission. Go to Tahiti and collect over 1,000 breadfruit plants to bring to the West Indies. On the way, he would also chart unexplored Pacific routes. Meanwhile, his presence would also contest France's claim to Tahiti. But to outfit the ship for this special mission, Bligh had to give up the great cabin, usually reserved for the captain's quarters, to become essentially a garden. It had special potholders, a ceiling grill to let in sunlight, and a system to collect water for reuse after watering the young trees. This, of course, only made these space problems for humans worse. But still, even with the frustrating delays, the cramped conditions, and Bligh's low salary, honestly, he was still in quite high spirits when the Bounty left England. Because Bligh had wanted this mission, believing his destiny lay in the Pacific. Bligh was an experienced sailor who'd first gone to sea at 7 as a cabin boy and won promotion to lieutenant after his service in the Battle of Dogger Bank and the Great Siege of Gibraltar. But his crowning glory had been serving as master on the HMS Resolution during Cook's 3rd Pacific voyage. In fact, he'd personally seen Cook clubbed to death by native Hawaiian warriors. We discussed Cook in our Exploring the Pacific series, but his death is actually a story that's so complicated and nuanced it deserves its own episode. We'll get to it one day. After Cook's death, Bligh had been responsible for much of the navigation that brought the expedition back home, especially since Cook's second-in-command died of tuberculosis as they surveyed the coast of the Pacific Northwest. And now, Bligh saw the Bounty mission as a second grab at Pacific glory. But he'd been given a small 46-man crew, and a particularly young one. At 33, Bligh was one of the older men on the ship, plus 2 of the expedition were civilian botanists. Gardeners brought to care for the trees. So Bligh seasoned the crew by sprinkling in a few other veterans of Cook's voyages who spoke Tahitian and had Pacific experience. Meanwhile, the youngest members of the group essentially got their positions by nepotism. Bligh picked Thomas Hayward as one of his the lowest officer rank. often held by early teenagers, because the boy's sister was a friend of his wife. Then the similarly named teenage aristocrat Peter Haywood, oh, that's not going to get confusing at all in this story, similarly was a friend of Bligh's in-laws. In fact, Haywood was among a group of young gentlemen who came aboard to get naval experience, and who held the same social status as midshipmen while not having a military rank. Actually, this bears talking about, because unless you are deep into the world of 18th century British military like Rob is, you might be like me and not realize something. The Royal Navy essentially structured its ranks around the rigid British class system. It didn't matter if you were a 30-year-old able seaman who'd been on ships for 20 years, you still had to listen to the pimple-faced midshipmen who'd gotten aboard yesterday. Officers, and to a lesser extent, warrant officers like the Bounty's master John Fryer, were of a higher social class from crewmen. They had separate areas for eating and sleeping. They weren't allowed to fraternize with the men, dressed entirely differently, and often were literally above them, since only they were allowed to use the raised quarterdeck at the ship's stern. So these random scientists and young gentlemen that didn't have military ranks were still treated like officers, because as gentlemen, they were considered above the seamen. They were essentially interns treated with respect as officers, because one day they would become officers, etc., etc. And among these young gentlemen was Bligh's favorite pair, Fletcher Christian. The men had met in the merchant service 2 years before and immediately formed a bond of mentorship. Bligh had even taught Christian how to navigate and invited him to his house to play with his children. You see, Christian was from a rich family who had fallen on hard times and had also gone to sea quite late. His first appointment as a cabin boy was at age 17, when the average age was between 9 and 12. But Christian was charismatic and handsome, with a penchant for getting into trouble on shore involving women. Though he was technically a young gentleman, Bligh quickly made him master's mate. So this was the merry crew that set off toward Tahiti on the HMS Bounty, its officers crammed into small cabins to accommodate the breadfruit load. Yet it wasn't all bad, because Bligh was set on emulating his hero, James Cook, who had always set great store in keeping punishments light and giving his men citrus in order to ward off scurvy. Heck, at the commencement of this voyage, Bligh even made a public statement that his goal was not a single flogging or case of scurvy. So that's positive, right? Well, yes and no, because Bligh's health measures actually became the first rift between he and his crew. And that's kind of because he was trying to be James Cook. Okay, see, the thing about Cook is that he was, James flippin' Cook. By the time Bligh sailed with him, Cook was already a renowned and respected national hero and had a personal charisma that Bligh simply lacked. I mean, when Cook asked you to do something, you just did it kind of because you wanted to. You wanted the dude to like you. But on the other hand, if you were rolling up William Bligh as a D&D character, for instance, let's just say charisma would have been his dump stat. Like intelligence off the charts, and sure, an 18 constitution, but socially fluent, not so much. First off, Bligh swore like, well, a fucking sailor, which to be fair was what he'd been all his life. And while he wanted to avoid using the lash, the former merchant sailors of his crew were unused to the verbal abuse that was fairly common in naval life. When Bligh dressed you down for doing something wrong, he made it sting, but then sort of also forgot about it immediately. Whereas his younger subordinates had a tendency to stew it. His health and hygiene measures also bordered on obsessive. Even with strenuous sea duties, the lack of exercise on ships often proved detrimental to physical fitness. So Bligh hired a blind fiddle player on the crew and insisted that the sailors dance, often for 3 hours a day after finishing duty. In retaliation, the alcoholic ship's doctor started to give out sick leave to sailors who wanted out of it, claiming they had scurvy, a diagnosis chosen specifically to spite Bligh. But there were some upsides to the lieutenant's regime as well. For instance, he divvied up the ship into 3 watches instead of the usual 2, which allowed every man to get a full night's sleep. So overall, morale did remain high on the voyage to Tahiti, even when stormy winds forced them to abandon rounding South America and instead take a 7,000-mile detour around Africa. Bligh, who had been denied a purser by the Admiralty and therefore had to personally make decisions about food rationing, started to keep an eagle eye on the ship's stores in order to ensure they had enough food. Nevertheless, the men were excited to see the land they called Otaheite, and Bligh's relationship with Christian at this point remained strong. In fact, actually a little too strong, if you ask me. It definitely smacked of favoritism. At first, Christian, who, remember, came aboard as an unranked gentleman, was merely a master's mate, assisting ship's master Jonathan Fryer with navigation. But while at sea, Bligh promoted Christian to acting lieutenant, making him second in command and demoting Fryer to third. Then, at a port in Africa, Bligh lent Christian a relationship. Oh, and after said pit stop, Christian was also among the men who reported to sick call with syphilis. Yet, despite these small irritants and it turned out, a place they would be for a while. You see, soon after arriving and getting permission from the king, the gardeners informed Bligh that to ensure the 1,015 breadfruit plants would survive the voyage, they'd need to spend several months growing in the earth that they'd been transplanted in. How many months exactly? Oh, 5. 5 months. Okay, all right, well, you know, what do you suppose a bunch of young cooped-up sailors get up to in Tahiti for 5 months, a place where the sexual culture is a bit looser than they are used to? Well, actually, to be fair, quite a bit more than you might think. Yes, of course, many sailors formed partnerships with Tahitian women, though how those women looked upon this is open to interpretation. Some, like Christian, even made these partnerships despite knowing they had syphilis, but yeah, welcome to European exploration in the Pacific, and some dudes just being awful in general. But while many retellings of this story do like to focus on the sexy sexual aspects, that wasn't really the only notable element of their stay. The Bounty crew were living among the Tahitians, learning new skills around navigation, agriculture, and fishing. They were also coming to understand a climate that was, you know, to put it mildly, a little bit more pleasant than rainy, cold, misty England. And they were, many for the first time, experiencing a society different from the hierarchical power relationships of the British class system. A thing that was probably all the more shocking because they just experienced Navy life, which operated on an even more rigid structure. Of course, Tahitian culture had its classes and status relationships, but as guests, these may have appeared invisible to the crew. Tahitian politics operated by different rules, meaning sexual freedom wasn't the only kind of liberation that they were experiencing. It was inevitable that a few crew members would try to desert, 3 of them to be precise. And when they turned themselves in, Bligh had to administer a measure he wanted to avoid: splash. But there were more reasons than desertion to be unhappy with this crew. Bligh felt that in the 5 months ashore, they'd become lax and dissolute. They'd neglected basic ship maintenance. And upon inspecting the hull, Bligh became furious when he found that the spare sails had not been aired and were developing mold by the time they were ready to leave. And the crew carefully loaded the breadfruit plants into the converted great cabin. Bligh was starting to seethe over lapses and provocations, both real and imagined, causing the crew in turn to christen him with a new name, the Bounty Bastard. But nevertheless, the HMS Bounty set sail from Tahiti on April 4th, 1789. 24 days later, the mutiny would begin, and the events would be sensationalized for years to come. Of course, sensationalism is something we still live with today, even in our current times national news. For example, take these headlines about Trump saying U.S. ships should be allowed to travel through the Panama and Suez canals for free. Thanks to today's sponsor, Ground News, I can see that it's been reported by over 200 news outlets on the left, right, and center, which is super handy when I'm trying to compare everything and Ground News, of course, is a website and app designed to help you pull back the curtain on your bias. Every day they collect thousands of news articles and organize them by showing you exactly how news stories are being covered and compare ways different news organizations cover the same. Compare headlines to see how these biases might affect framing, right? So, for example, one headline from a right-leaning publication states, Trump calls for free passage of U.S. ships through Panama-Suez Canal, while on the left, a headline reads, Trump demands free passage for ships crossing Panama-Suez Canal. And with Ground News, you can see all of the specific differences between the left and right's reporting, and they even have something called a blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum, which I find just super helpful in discerning what folks outside my usual news bubbles are talking about. Seriously, Ground News is an incredibly useful tool for sifting through the tons of daily misinformation and bias we have to deal with on the regular now, making the media landscape more transparent than ever. So if that seems useful to you, we can get you fine folks 40% off a Ground News Vantage subscription by going to ground.news/extra via the link below or the QR code right there. Look at that! There's some news you can actually use. Again, for a way better news feed, click or scan right here, and then once you're in the know, why not check out our next video here? If you took all of the epicness... Sumer, 4,000 years ago, the woman recites a hymn to the goddess Ninkasi as she works. Ninkasi, it is you who water the earth-covered malt. The noble dogs guard it even from the royalty. It is you who soak the malt in a jar. It is you who spread the cooked mash on large repasts. It is you who holds with both hands the great sweet wort, brewing it with honey and wine. You place the fermenting vat to say about it? Oh yeah, there is. In fact, our biggest problem isn't going to be how to fill this series, but actually how much stuff we're going to have to leave out, because the story of beer is that massive. From its origins of being brewed in Neolithic baskets, it rose to an industrialized beverage shipped around the world, facilitating many historical events along the way, from helping the British take over India to the establishment of food quality laws. Not to mention, pubs and beer halls have been the headquarters of many revolutions, from the Green Dragon Tavern of the Sons of Liberty to Hitler's Beer Hall Punch. Beer's story is a global one. No one person or culture invented it. In fact, beer was probably more discovered than created. And that discovery happened all around the world, independently, so far back that we have no idea when it first came to be. See, beer not only predates writing, it also predates pottery, domesticated grain, and possibly even settled villages and organized religions. It's ancient to the point of being primordial. First appearing in the archaeological record via traces of it on a potsherd discovered in what is now Ireland. A potsherd that's 7,000 years old. So given how ancient beer is, how, when, and why it came to be requires some speculation. Now, alcohol would have been known to early humans, even in hunter-gatherer societies, because it occurs naturally. Fruit left out too long can naturally ferment and create alcohol. And that fermentation happens when a single cell fungus called yeast feeds on sugar, producing carbon dioxide and ethanol as waste products. Seriously, forget dogs or cats. Yeast is actually man's best friend. I mean, just look at these little geeky boys. Aw, lovely buddies. Sorry, Zoe, but it's kinda true. Yes, dogs help ancient humans with hunting and security, and cats definitely kept the roads down, and I know you do a wonder on my taxes, but these eat carbohydrates and ooze out alcohol, an action crucial for making both bread and beer. So Neolithic humans didn't understand fermentation or what alcohol was. They knew the important stuff. It was a substance that induced a state of altered consciousness and tasted pretty good. Good enough at least to attract elephants and monkeys, who also loved to get smashed on rotten fruit. This fermented fruit is what you know as wine, which we associate with grapes today, but has been historically made with any fruit, from plum to dates, or even sap or olive. Beer, by contrast, comes from fermented grain, which does not appear natural. And to make it, you need semi-skilled agriculture. So, here's how one theory suggests beer came to be. First, hunter-gatherers realized that grains were a steady source of nutrition. If you pulled grains from wild cereals like barley and wheat, then soaked or boiled them in water, they made an oatmeal or thin gruel that was rich in nutrients. Further, this could be added to soups as a thickener. And grain, unlike fruit and meat, could easily be stored for later. Throw a bunch of grain in a basket, and provided it doesn't get wet, it can last years. But you know, lugging around a basket of grain isn't really ideal while chasing a mammoth, so these hunter-gatherers started forming settlements where wild grains were abundant. There, humans learned to make bread 11,000 to 14,000 years ago. Then, at one point or another, some dough was contaminated by yeast, causing it to ferment and rise due to the carbon dioxide forming bubbles. Beer followed a bit later as an offshoot of bread making. And perhaps fittingly, given beer's reputation as a relaxing drink, the prevailing theory for this cultural defining beverage's discovery involves someone being lazy. The thought goes that a grain store, maybe a basket, was left out in the rain and sprouted. Wild yeast then colonized the mixture, or someone either accidentally or on purpose dropped bread into it. Then afterward, someone decided to drink the resulting fermentation and found that it made them pleasantly intoxicated, and presto, the first keg stand, metaphoric. Then it wasn't long until people were making beer on purpose. It appeared on the tabulation accounts of ancient Sumer, and a recently discovered brewery site in China is 5,000 years old. Our first recipe, quoted in this episode's introduction, comes from a hymn to the Sumerian goddess Ninkasi, praising her creation of the drink, while telling brewers how to replicate it. It was recorded 3,900 years ago, but it's probably... Yeah, beer was so important, it had its own goddess. Which makes sense, because it was a cornerstone of civilization. Humans in the Fertile Crescent increasingly took up settled agriculture in order to subsist off of bread and beer, a lifestyle that led to larger populations, permanent structures, and irrigation, aka cities. In these settlements, they kept grain in common storehouses overseen by priests, and one theory goes that these grain stores gradually evolved, gaining more religious functions to become the first temples, and writing was invented to catalog their contents. In fat times, the temple would collect the grain, and then in lean times, they would distribute it. And that distribution often came in the form of beer. Indeed, during the construction of the pyramids, beer was one of the main forms of payment. In fact, there's even a theory that goes, given the ecology of the area, the wine mentioned in the Bible might have been a translation error, and what people were actually drinking was beer. In fact, it was a major selling point for living in cities. Eat bread, divide labor, ride out bad harvests, and drink beer. Heck, even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we have a series on and you can watch here, the wild man Enkidu is civilized and turned human by the consumption of bread and beer. Beer had become the symbol of complex society and necessary for living in cities. See, the problem with cities back then is that human waste quickly poisoned nearby water sources, making them unsafe to drink. But the alcohol in beer was sufficient to kill any microbes that affected humans. So beer was not just a pleasure drink, but a necessary technology for urban living. It was also a source of food, since beer back then was thicker than we think drink consumed socially in common. A sign of trust, since with everyone drinking beer from the same vessel, there was no chance of poisoning. And along with other drinks from common containers, like coffee, tea, or wine, beer became synonymous with hospitality. Also, ancient people made a range of beer, knowing that if they tinkered with the ingredients, they could get different results. From ancient Egypt, we see records discussing different types and styles of beer with different alcohol strengths. Granted, most beer people drank was short turned around batches that were only 1% alcohol by volume, but there were others left to sit longer to become stronger. Plus, there were flavor additives like honey, spices, and fruit. And though the fermentation process was a mystery, there was an understanding that some prized magical pots, called in records, the pots that make the beer good, simply produced better brew, even without dropping bread in. This was because yeast had permanently colonized cracks and imperfections in the pots. But to the ancient people, beer's transformation appeared magical, especially since it created an altered state when consumed. So it's no wonder that it was used in religious rituals and associated with a range of goddesses. Oh yeah, goddesses, because beer was largely made in the household at the same time as making bread for thousands of years. Brewing was primarily a woman's task. But further north, in Europe, change was coming, both to the process of making and consuming beer itself, and for the women who controlled production. Rome, 98 CE. Roman historian Tacitus takes a sip of wine as he pores over scrolls. He's compiling an ethnographic study of the German tribes, including their drinking customs. To pass an entire day and night in drinking disgraces no one, he says to the scribe he's dictating to. Their quarrels, as it might be expected with intoxicated people, are seldom fought with mere abuse, but commonly with wounds and bloodshed. Yet it is at their feasts that they consult on the reconciliation of enemies, matrimonial alliances, choosing chiefs, and even on peace and war. For they think at no time is the mind more open to simplicity of purpose, or more warmed to noble aspirations. After a digression, he describes their particular alcohol. A liquor for drinking is made out of barley or other grains, which once rather has a certain resemblance to wine. Revolting barbarians, he thinks, as he takes another sip of his fermented grapes. Beer was the drink of the Fertile Crescent, of Egypt and North Africa. Indeed, the beverage ruled the ancient world, until it was conquered by the same enemy that menaced all of Europe, the Romans. The Romans were a wine culture, a drink they considered synonymous with civilization, made from a crop that did well in the Italian environment. From the palaces to the far provinces, to be an ancient Roman was to drink wine, and they exported everywhere in their burgeoning empire. All other alcohols they labeled as foreign, perhaps the worst slur in Roman culture. The irony, of course, being that wine was imported to Rome from Greece, and they learned much of the cultivation from it from Carthage. Heck, even their sneering dismissal of other drinks was, like practically all their gods, inherited from the Greeks. But as the Roman Empire pushed north into Europe, it increasingly contacted other drinking traditions, ones based around what can broadly be called beer. Now, all of the information we have on drinking in Northern and Central Europe at this period comes from Roman sources and archaeological evidence, so there's no gaps. But Roman writers do note that even at the time of the Gallic Wars, the people of Central and Northern Europe were barrel-making cultures who enjoyed a wide variety of drinks. These included ale mixed with honey, types of local wine, and mead, which is made from fermented honey rather than grain. But most importantly, they make it very clear that to the Romans, all types of ale were absolutely gross. Beer was generally made from barley, a grain they mostly fed to horses, i.e. literal animal feed. And they even punished military units by making them live on barley. So when they saw people creating a barley mash, letting it rot in a wooden barrel, and then drinking it, that was a double yuck. Though just FYI, this rotting was the same process of fermentation that produced their precious wine, so glass houses and all that. Some tribes, like the Gauls, who inhabited what is now France, took to Roman wine and even began cultivating it themselves, while others were more resistant. In his Gallic War, Caesar wrote that the toughest and wildest tribes were the Germans, and in particular the Belgians, who both refused Rome's drink. They do not at all allow wine to be imported among them, he wrote, since they believe that by it men are made soft and effeminate for the endurance of hardship. And Caesar agreed, believing that wine drinking had weakened the Gauls and assisted Rome's civilized conquest. Now, Caesar never mentioned beer at all, but later Roman authors expanded on this idea of beer making barbarians wild and strong, with the comforts of civilization, particularly wine, enfeebling them. At the same time, the rulers of the tribes who came under the Roman banner started drinking wine, making it associated with higher status. And do you detect a stereotype forming here? Wine, the drink of the civilized and powerful, of educated city dwellers, one that tames wild men, but makes them effeminate and weak. And beer, a common man's brew that makes drinkers strong and wild, courageous and quarrel-prone, that imparts the raw toughness civilization lacks. And like it or not, those ideas are still with us today. It should be noted, however, that Roman troops did gradually start drinking beer, especially in far-flung posts like Britain, where wine wasn't available. And that's kind of how things stood, with wine as the dominant drink until the Western Roman Empire fell and the transport networks for wine crumbled. So what are people drinking after Rome's collapse, you ask? Well, in places like Normandy and Bordeaux that produced wine grapes, still wine. But outside those areas, mead was now the most important beverage of the elite, particularly in Germany, Scandinavia, and Britain. There, mead halls were an important part of culture, a communal spot for socializing, swearing oaths, and conducting business. Now we could spend an entire episode on mead halls and their social political functions, but right now, I want you to look at its architecture, with its large open spaces, benches, and long tables. What does that look like to you? Yep, it's a beer hall, the kind largely associated today with Germany, and if you're in my neck of the woods, Astoria. What up, Bohemian Hall? Sorry, back on track. Though spurned by the powerful, ale had never gone fully out of fashion with average households. It was too useful and easy to make, and therefore the preferred everyday beverage. In Germany, it held on tenaciously, and in Ireland, which the Romans decided not to mess with, beer was never interrupted at all. Now, the idea that medieval people drank beer due to water being unsafe is mostly a myth, the Middle Ages not being ancient Sumer after all, and fresh supplies of clean water were abundant even in cities. But ale was considered more pleasurable, hearty, and hospitable. A young monk spoke for most Europeans when he observed that he drank, quote, ale if I can get it, and water if I have no ale, unquote. By the year 1000, ale was also starting to become commercial. Monks brewed it for the poor or sold it to sustain the monastery. Ale was also considered a type of liquid bread, meaning it could be drunk for sustenance during fast days, when the monks were only supposed to consume bread and water. However, women still did the vast majority of brewing. They brewed for the household and sold or exchanged whatever they had left over. Sometimes, neighbors took turns in a goods exchange, with one neighbor brewing 1 week and the other the next. Inevitably, some women were better at it than others and began to open the front rooms of their homes as businesses. When the beer was ready, this alewife would put an ale wand, a sprig of branch, outside to signal they were open for business. Then neighbors would come to either fill their buckets to take back home or bring cups to consume beer on the premises. These homes, dubbed alehouses in England, were the first type of public house, And soon they were joined by taverns, which also sold wine and offered private rooms for the wealthy, and inns that offered food, overnight accommodation, stables, and often financially incentivized company in the rooms upstairs. The ale they served was porridge-like, full of spice and berry flavors, and mostly the low-alcohol small beer. People drank 10 liters of it a day. By the reign of Henry III in the 13th century, the trade was big enough to attract regulation. As part of a law called the Assize of Bread and Ale, the first food and drink quality legislation in Britain, local officials called ale tasters would tour establishments every 6 weeks, doing the very hard work of ensuring the ale being sold was of sufficient quality, fairly priced, and had its strength labeled. Ooh, that sounds like a tough job, Zoe, but someone had to do it. You know, preferably someone who gave their brother-in-law the mayor a nice fat purse right before their appointment. Delicious, delicious corruption. But on the continent, a new innovation would change beer forever. Because in Germany, people were adding hop to ale in order to give it a more complex, bitter, smoky flavor, and also preserve it. This also, by some definitions, turns ale into true beer. Now, sometimes it's been said that the polymath abbot, Hildegard von Bingen, was the first to hop ale, creating what we now know as beer. And while it's possible she did some experiments with that, you know, between running a convent, writing poetry and plays, receiving visions from God, practicing medicine, drafting works of philosophy and science, creating her own language, and being the most prolific musical composer of the Middle Ages, people had been experimenting with hops for centuries before her birth. So, you know, maybe we can't chalk this one up to her. And hops changed everything. Taste-wise, sure, but also when it came to production. Hopped beer lasted weeks, meaning for the first time, beer could be made in large quantities and exported product far across the sea. So grab a barrel and roll with us to the next chapter as we tour guilds, swig with Martin Luther, and ask the pressing question, is getting drunk a sin? Germany, 1539. The table at Martin Luther's home seats 50 people, and nearly every seat is full. He's in fine form tonight. He calls the Pope the Antichrist, refers to the church as a brothel, and discourses about the noxious farts previous popes have let off. Real rebellious tone. As he speaks, his wife, Catherine, a former nun, fills his stein. She makes the beer herself, thousands of liters a year in the Luther's personal brewery. And it's good, lubricating these table sessions. Plus, the beer is hop, itself an act of rebellion, as hops currently are an untaxed weed, different from the spice mix the Catholic monks use in their brewing. As Luther continues, one listener takes notes and will publish these remarks in a book called Table Talk. Others will create beer steins showing the Pope as the Antichrist. It would seem that Catholicism's monopoly on Christianity and brewing is falling apart over Katharina's fine beer. When we left off, alehouses, taverns, and inns had come on the scene. And just as important, people had started hopping ale, a method that properly turned the beverage into beer, creating a more complex tasting product that could be made in larger batches without spoiling, shipped, and to a certain extent, even branded. Indeed, hops was the first true step in turning beer into a viable commercial product. And as the 14th and 15th centuries wound on, certain breweries started becoming famous for their beer. One major center of brewing was Munich, where the Augustiner Brewery, run by Augustine monks, formed in 1328. Soon, they were experimenting with a new type of strong beer, known as Bock. Much as France was already famous in the medieval era for its wine, Munich became known for its quality beer, a reputation they tried to protect by passing a beer purity law in 1560, declaring that the only ingredients in beer could be water, barley, and hops, yeast being considered part of the production rather than an ingredient. While this was not the first beer quality law in the Holy Roman Empire, nor did it apply outside of Bavaria, it was a masterful exercise in branding, declaring to the European market that Munich cared about its beer. Not everyone, though, was so excited about hops. The English in particular considered hopped beer repulsive and unhealthy, a drink for foreigners, while unhopped, top-fermented ale was best for them. Even Shakespeare weighed in, having his heroes drink ale, not beer. And no wonder, for his father was an official ale taster. But beer was becoming more common in England. By 1574, 36% of London brewers had switched to hopped beer, leading to a competition between the two drinks. Unable to compete on longevity or its array of flavors, English ale brewers began tinkering to increase the amount of alcohol. London's beer brewers retaliated until England was awash in high-proof mixes, given hyperbolic names like Dragon's Milk, and English beer became thus known as both powerful and coming in a huge variety of flavors. In fact, the English market was huge, with a large number of independent brewers. This was partially because when Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, their brewing operations got turned over to laymen, creating a thriving professional industry large and respectable enough to form guilds. But not everyone was happy about that. For something like 7 millennia, female brewers weren't just at the center of beer manufacturing, they were beer manufacturing. And provided they only sold to neighbors, it stayed that way. But when beer became a fully fledged industry, women could no longer participate. To do that, they would have to hire and manage a staff, participate in guilds, travel away from the home to ship goods, and represent the brewery and sign contracts. All things women at the time were barred from doing. Still, a few did. Largely widows who showed up at guild meetings on behalf of their family until children came of age, yet that became less common over time. Women were still part of the cycle, but now they were the ones serving the beer, not making it. Meanwhile, another group was starting to worry about the effects of all this brewing: the leaders of church and state. At first, their concerns were centered around taverns. In 1400, when Chaucer set his Canterbury Tales in a tavern, a space where a knight could rub shoulders with a miller, nuns, a pardoner, and a wife of Bath, he was reflecting the reality of his time. Taverns were a secular space where, by tradition, class distinctions were set aside and people could speak freely. This not only made it a congregating space to rival that of churches, and clerics often complained of people being on a bench in a tavern rather than on their knees in a chapel, it also was a political center. One that could be used to criticize the crown or engage in sedition, especially because, with enough beer, things just kinda slip out. Like Martin Luther at his table, or the gunpowder plot, hatched in a series of London taverns. So yeah, they weren't really off the mark on that sedition thing. But there wasn't really much they could do. Beer was a staple of life, and by Elizabeth's time, London had a public house for every 125 residents, meaning this boozy genie was well out of the bottle. Leaders also increasingly worried about drunkenness, a social ill that became more concerning as European society professionalized and became more advanced. See, here's the thing about medieval peasants. They didn't do a lot, like they had to plant one season, harvest another, keep animals, and get to church. And that was kind of it. They even had a lot of religious holidays, meaning that if some were drunk here and there, it wasn't that big an issue. But then society started developing more specialist artisan trades, once with business dealers, where they had to fulfill contracts and be places on time, meaning being drunk became a bit more detrimental. Some of the first concerns around problem drinking centered around young students at 13th century universities who were infamous for imbibing mass quantities of wine and terrorizing the residents of the town. In both Oxford and Paris, arguments over tavern bills broke into deadly rioting. In Paris, it led to a 2-year student strike after authorities killed several scholars, and after the townspeople of Oxford finally had enough, formed mobs and hung a few students, a group of faculty and scholars fled and formed a new university. They called it Cambridge. However, one part of the world had already acted on this problem. In the 7th century, after a series of incidents among his followers, the Prophet Muhammad had decided to outright ban Muslims drinking alcohol. But Christianity wasn't exactly into that. Not only did Jesus drink wine in the Bible, one of his signature miracles was turning water into wine. Plus, in the Catholic Church, wine is a sacred part of communion, and lots of monasteries made money for the church and the poor by brewing. On the Protestant side, they'd been instrumental in spreading the adoption of hops, again a substance that was not taxed and differed from the blend of spices monks used. And while he did lament the drunkenness beer brought at times, Luther himself loved a good brew, particularly if it was made with medicinal spices to help his constipation. In other words, beer had become an institution, a substance so important to European life, finance, and culture, it could not be acted against. So, it was informally agreed upon that instead of banning the substance itself, civil and church leaders would essentially tell people not to go overboard. Instead, more scorn was heaped on the newly created distilled spirits discovered by alchemists. Originally sold in single-shot glasses as medicine, they were increasingly being drunk for pleasure. There was, however, an outlier. One Anabaptist reformer dared to call on fellow Christians to abstain from even beer and wine. Drinking, he argued, inevitably led to sin. His fellow Protestants promptly beheaded him. But the 16th and 17th centuries were not only the era of Reformation, they were also the era of exploration. As the Spanish conquered Central and South America and the Portuguese went to Asia, they also discovered new worlds of alcohol. In Peru, they found the Incas making maize beer. The Aztecs, meanwhile, fermented agave sap into a cloudy beer-like concoction, which once distilled with European technology, became mezcal and tequila. In China and Japan, sailors encountered fine rice wines. Wherever they went, they found drinks made from fruit, tree bark, and palm sap. But when the English landed in North America, they contacted a people who, while they fermented alcohol out of mesquite pods and maple sap depending on their region, had not encountered stronger grain-based alcohols. The settlers decided to change that. So follow us now as we enter the age of revolution, where American rebels plot in taverns, Catherine the Great swigs Russian Imperial Stout, and a long sea voyage puts the Indian into pale ale. Green Dragon Tavern, Boston, 1768. The Sons of Liberty have gathered to lift tankards in solidarity. They do so surrounding a silver bowl filled with rum punch, made by one of their members, Paul Revere. Another among them is a malter named Samuel Adams, who produces the cerealized mixture sold to brewers to make beer. And across from him is John Hancock, a merchant specializing in importing Spanish wine. They swill American beer and rum, talking about how new British laws have impacted their lives. The Sugar Act squeezed the rum business. Trade restrictions kept the colonists from selling their products, including alcohol, abroad. And now they have to quarter British soldiers in their homes, barns, and stables, and were legally required to give them 5 pints of beer a day. In retaliation, Boston brewers have instituted a boycott, refusing to buy British malt. The colonies are drinking their way toward revolution. By the 18th century, Europe was barreling toward revolution, and the Green Dragon Tavern was not alone as a center for dissent. During both the American and French revolutions, rebels organized themselves around taverns and other drinking establishments, and later beer halls would serve a similar role in the revolutions of 1848. But another revolution would take place at the same, one centered on the process of making beer. See, for most of history, beer had little competition. Apart from grape-producing regions where wine was cheap enough for common people to enjoy, there just wasn't another commercial beverage that could compete with it. But now, there were tons, with the increasing global trade network bringing more options. Coffee, originally from Ethiopia, and that you can learn more about in our History of Coffee series here, had made its way through Europe. Not to mention, tea had arrived on the scene from China, and Europe had even gotten a taste for the Aztec practice of drinking chocolate. But the biggest rival of beer was distilled spirits, which began circulating in the 13th century as medicine, and named with nebulous terms like strong waters or aqua vitae. And a few centuries of experimentation meant that by the 18th century, brandy, rum, gin, and whiskey were not only commercially viable products, but increasingly tasted way better than years prior. So if you wanted to get drunk, and no ifs, ands, or buts about it, the early modern Europeans most assuredly did. Spirits got the job done a lot faster and at a lower cost, though with a lot more danger as well. During the gin craze of the 18th century, London started seeing a level of drunkenness it had never experienced before. People were dying of alcohol poisoning, a thing almost impossible to do with lower strength beers common at the time. Drunk Londoners were dying in gory accidents, losing their businesses, and even selling their or their children's clothes to buy gin. And while this created a moral panic about drunkenness in the lower classes, and it's always about the lower classes, I mean members of parliament were actually admired for their ability to give speeches while drunk, this moral outcry also provided cover for beer. In contrast, beer was seen as wholesome, even healthy. In 1751, English artist William Hogarth published The Prince, Beer Street, and Gin Lane to make an explicit side-by-side comparison. On Gin Lane, the people are dying skeletal zombies. A carpenter pawns his tools as buildings fall apart, while violence and crime are rampant. Meanwhile, over on Beer Street, the only one going out of business is the pawnbroker. Everyone is rotund, happy, prosperous, patriotic, and glowing with health and virality. And not only was beer supposedly healthy, it was entering a new era of innovation. Large brewers were starting to produce it in larger volumes, and new types of beer popped up all over Europe. Crucially, these were not created using additives, but rather by innovation in the process of fermentation. In the 1760s, a new series of technologies appeared that meant beer could be produced with greater consistency and control. Steam engines made large-scale factories easier to manage. Thermometers and hydrometers meant beer could be monitored for temperature and consistency while brewing. And the drum roaster, created in 1817, sealed out the smoky flavor malt required by roasting directly over wood, straw, or a coal concentrate called coke. One of these new exciting beers arose in England just before the gin craze. By the 1720s, London brewers were selling a new brew called porter, a name that supposedly arose because it was popular among the porters that carried loads on the streets and docks. Made with a dark malt and heavily hopped, it was delicious, cheap, and lasted for months. Porter beer traveled all over Europe, but it was in Ireland where it made its biggest impact. There, breweries began making it particularly strong, or extra stout in the language of the time. And Irish brewers often used malt that had been cooked until it was crisp, giving the thick beer a deep black color. And one brewer became so famous for it, his name has become forever linked with the drink, Arthur Guinness. Though another famous stout was Catherine Grey, who insisted that her crew be supplied with the best English beer. Supposedly, English sailors found that beer shipped to Russia tended to freeze, and in response, developed a brew with a high enough alcohol content to prevent ice from forming. Thus, the story goes, Russian Imperial Stout was born. Though that wasn't the only beer created by a seaboard. Pale ales, a golden or amber-colored ale, had arrived around the same time as porter. It's a beer the East India Company was interested in, given that porter was too heavy for company officials and troops serving in the heat of the subcontinent. So they went to a brewer named George Hodgson, who was just up the river from their docks. After experimenting with other beers, he tried making a well-known brew called Oktoberbier. This was a heavily autumn beer that was supposed to mature in the cask for a year, before being bottled to mature for another year. But Hodgson got extremely lucky. The conditions of heat and agitation on the 4-month journey to India sped up the maturation process, and it arrived ready to drink. And though his sons went on to lose the contract, a rival brewery recreated the formula, which by then was already known as India Pale Ale. Yet beer innovation was not the sole province of the English. Most German beers had traditionally been lager, a name derived from a process called lagering, which meant letting them ferment in basements under relatively low temperatures. One type, ice bomb, was even left out to freeze in winter, and the ice discarded in order to concentrate it. These beers were often dark and sweet, but that was changing. In the early 1930s, Gabriel Sedlmayr of the Spaten Brewery in Munich traveled Europe in hopes of learning how to modernize the German brewing industry. Supposedly, he even engaged in industrial espionage, stealing malt, hops, and beer samples from the British breweries and hiding them in a cane. When he returned, he adopted thermometers, installed the first brewery steam engine in Germany, and tried making a pale ale with the process of lagering, thereby inventing pale lager. Another Bavarian brewer, Josef Groll, decided to iterate on pale lager at his own brewery in Pilsen, in what is now the Czech Republic. That resulting beer would be named after his city, Pilsner. This pale lager, or Pilsner, some use them interchangeably, exploded. Light and refreshing, it was the perfect type of drink for warmer climates. Bavarian brewers then took it to the United States, where it became the leading style, and German immigrants also took it to Mexico, where most beers are still lagered, and garnished it with local touches like lime, salt, and chili powder. Now, trust me, Rob and I could go on like this for hours, and we have in private meetings, but you get the point. By the mid-19th century, there were more beers available than ever before, and in greater quantities. And breweries were no longer at-home operations, but large industrial factories. For example, in 1814, a series of rusting tank rings at a brewery in London gave way, flooding the district with beer, wiping out multiple buildings, and killing 8 people. Yeah, that's how much beer they were making, enough to cause a natural disaster. But a happier thing happened a few years earlier in 1810, a wedding. On a fine October day, Crown Prince Ludwig married Princess Therese on a meadow outside Munich. They held a parade and days of horse racing, with beer of course present in abundance. It was so fun that they decided to do it again the next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. In fact, apart from cancellations due to wars and epidemics, it's been held every year since, both in Munich and in German communities all over the world. You probably know it as Oktoberfest, and I've been to a few. But German immigrants would carry more than drinking festivals abroad. And in the next chapter, humanity finally discovers yeast. The temperance movement leads to a crusade against alcohol, and a German immigrant, fresh out of the Union Army, creates the largest beer company in the world. Aw, what a bud. Paris, 1876. Louis Pasteur is one of the greatest scientific minds in Europe, and he's turned his attention toward 2 things: beer and vengeance. 16 years earlier, he'd unlocked a millennia-old secret by proving that yeast, in the absence of oxygen, is what ferments sugar into alcohol. And then he thought he was done with beer until the war, the Franco-Prussian War, where France lost its hops-growing region of Alsace-Lorraine. For French pride, for French beer, he must again delve into the secrets of brewing in order to create what he calls a beer of national revenge. What he discovers this time are these specific microorganisms that make beer spoil or go sour, and he finds that bringing it to near boiling, pasteurizing it like with milk, will kill these organisms and increase the beer's stability and shelf life. Though this discovery will not remain French, it will inaugurate a new era, the age of scientific beer. Beer was going global, and industrialization was about to turn regional breweries into the massive beverage corporations we know today. Troops in British India, previously sickened in large numbers by local drinks, were now sipping on IPAs brewed in the UK. Guinness-style Pilsner was being produced in Mexico, and the twin forces of trade and colonialism were bringing European beer to foreign shores and founding some of the largest breweries of the modern era. In 1869, a Norwegian-American opened a brewery in Yokohama, which would eventually become Kirin. 7 years later, the Meiji government founded Sapporo Brewery, and what would become Asahi followed in 1889. China had an active beer brewing culture for thousands of years, but when grains like millet fell out of the diet, brewing shifted to rice. Yet as European powers carved out pieces of the Qing dynasty in the 19th century, foreigners began re-establishing Chinese beer. Poles, Germans, and Czechs started breweries in Harbin, but it was in one particular city that enjoyed English-German success when it founded a brewery in Qingdao in 1903. Today, China is the world's largest beer consumer, and Qingdao is the second most popular brew in China, surpassed only by Snow Beer, which traces its origins to a brewery established by Kirin in 1936, in what was then Japan's Manchurian puppet state. But things were brewing back in Europe too, specifically Northern Europe. In 1847, a young Danish man named J.C. Jacobsen founded a brewery outside Copenhagen, using steam power and other new industrial technologies to produce Danish Pilsner. With his eye on the future, he named it after his 5-year-old son, Carl. Thus, Carlsberg was born. 17 years later, it gained some competition when a 22-year-old bought an outdated 16th century brewery in Amsterdam. Determined to modernize it, he hired a student of Louis Pasteur to find and culture new types of bottom-fermenting yeast, and he christened both the brewery and his beer with his own name, Heineken. Together, these rivals kick-started the scientific age of brewing. Both Carlsberg and Heineken approached beer like a research project, establishing in-house laboratories where scientists experimented with new techniques, equipment, and ingredients. Beer got clearer and more carbonated. Meanwhile, the area that would become Germany was going through its own seismic shift that would have major echoes far across the Atlantic in America. Now, we know we haven't talked much about the United States in this series. Partially, it's because for thousands of years it didn't exist. Amazing, I know. But it's also because, well, American beer was just sort of fine. Sure, it was always there, and often affecting history. For example, the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock because it ran out of beer, and taxes on brewers helped fund Washington's army. But America's drink was whiskey, which was made easily from barley and corn, lasted longer, was easier to transport, and had a higher exchange value with the young country's largest trade partner, Native American tribes. In fact, colonial Americans drank only a third of the beer modern Americans do, and much less than their British cousins at the time. In fact, as an apprentice in London, Benjamin Franklin was scandalized by how much his British colleagues consumed. Until the 1840s, most U.S. beer was produced in the Northeast and consisted of English-style ales and porters. Yet America's laissez-faire economic freedom did make for mediocre brew. While most European countries had high standards for licensing breweries and quality control legislation, none of that existed in the United States. Beer was a product, not an art. But a revolution was coming. Specifically, the revolutions of 1848, a largely failed series of liberal uprisings which convinced a whole generation of young, largely middle-class Germans to immigrate to the United States and take their brewing knowledge with them. But when they arrived, they found the older German communities on the East Coast too crowded, especially for brewing. So instead, they struck out for the newly founded cities in the Midwest, where the land was literally free, cereals and hops grew easily, and the cold winters meant ice for lagering beer was abundant. There, they founded large and expanding lager breweries and brought the German drinking culture of beer gardens, with their friendly, visible, and community-oriented presentation to America. In 1855, Swabian immigrant Friedrich Müller arrived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and purchased an existing brewery to modernize, christening it with his Americanized name, Miller. The next year, Joseph Schlitz arrived in the city and married a brewer's widow, taking over the business and naming it after himself. But then when the Great Fire of 1871 destroyed Chicago, torching most of the rival breweries, he donated beer to get the city through, earning his brew the nickname, the beer that made Milwaukee famous. And then there was Frederick Pabst, who took ownership of his father-in-law's brewery and decided, as a branding exercise, to tie a blue ribbon around the bottles of the beer he'd named for his father-in-law, Philip Best. That's right, Best beer with a blue ribbon around it. And though Pabst Blue Ribbon had never actually won any awards, well, he just never corrected anyone who assumed it had. Miller, Schlitz, and Pabst, collectively known as the Beer Barons, became hugely wealthy, building enormous mansions and funneling their money into everything from resorts to some of the country's first amusement parks. But while they competed, they also banded together. During the Civil War, when Lincoln rolled out new taxes to pay for the conflict, they convinced him that clean, well-made, and healthy beer and lager should pay only 60% of the taxes that other beers did, giving them a major competitive advantage. But even so, all of them were about to be usurped. Adolphus Busch exited the Civil War both as a corporal in the Union Army and newly married to the daughter of St. Louis-based brewery owner Eberhard Anheuser. During the war, where 200,000 Germans served in the U.S. Army, he must have observed the popularity of lager beer amongst the ranks. When he bought his way into the Anheuser-Busch brewery, he used every modern technology he could find, from refrigeration to break reliance on winter ice and produce Pilsner year-round, to pasteurization that killed the microbes in beer, to industrial bottling machines, to refrigerated rail cars that shipped his product countrywide. He also pioneered branding and marketing, sending branded art and goods like ashtrays to bars, and convincing them to stock only his signature beer, a beer inspired by the brews from the Czech town of Budweis, or as we of course know it, Budweiser. By 1900, Busch was the king of beers in the Midwest, and America usurped Germany as the largest beer producer in the world. Anheuser-Busch was well on its way to becoming the planet's largest brewing company. Yet trouble was coming. See, for decades, concerns had been rising about America's drinking level, and beer, which often flew under the radar, landed in the crosshairs. Because the largely white, Protestant, long-established families who tended to favor temperance often didn't like what they thought of as immigrant drinks. The Irish with their whiskey, Italians with their wine, and especially after World War I, these German tycoons showing off their wealth gained from an empire of drunkenness. And that wave of anti-immigrant panic helped sweep Prohibition into law in 1920. Ironically though, Prohibition ultimately proved good for the big breweries. See, they weathered the storm by producing soft drinks while smaller brewers perished. And by killing the competition, it left the macro breweries in a position of dominance that's only changed in the last few decades. And that's how we got to the world we know today. How beer went from something made in Neolithic baskets to a massive product shipped and consumed around the world. But before last call, let's have one final toast across time. Come on, everybody in the past and present. Whether you're a beer man, peasant alewife, Sumerian Ninkasi worshiper, colonial Minuteman, Inca emperor, Apache warrior, German monk, pyramid builder, or scientist, let's all raise a glass. Here's to the drink that lubricated the gears of human history. Beer! Cheers, everyone. And you know, what better way to toast than with one of our brand new worst dads, moms, and kids in history mugs, complete with mugshot on the other side. This one is Vlad Dracul II, but we actually have 3 of these bad boys in our store, I believe, as of yesterday. I have a hard time keeping track. And if you have trouble keeping track of dates like myself, now that we have started shipping to our Kickstarter backers, our remaining History Happens Everyday calendars are available now in our store as well. It has beautiful art on the inside by David Hueso. It's got daily historical facts, and it's even got, let me show you this right here. It's got a QR code right here, so you can pick certain days that have these pictures here and learn more about it through our videos that this will take you to. It is absolutely awesome. I cannot believe how gorgeous this thing came out. But that is not all. We've done a big restock of our entire store for Black Friday, so you could snag some cool shirts like these, or limited edition pins, or actually, let me see if I can find this adorable Zoe plushie. Wait, no, this adorable plushie. You can see how I get confused. You can check all that out and more by clicking or scanning here, and then once you've handled some of your holiday shopping, check out our next video here. Thanks so much to Angelo Valenciana, Arcalite Games, Dominic Valenciana, Fox Dog, Hunter Z, Joseph Blaine, Kuyakoi, and Ziliad Architectures for being awesome legendary patrons.
Yes!
Hi, I'm Joel Olson. When I was a kid, I had cancer and was treated at St. Jude. I've been talking with other people who are like me.
I think I became more outgoing.
New York City, 1940. A team of policemen, sheriffs, lawyers, and carpenters kick at the door of the 4-story Harlem brownstone, but to no avail. The brothers within were 3 years behind on rent, you see, but the eviction squad found they couldn't get inside. Because as the police attacked fruitlessly with one fist and axe, the brothers lurked behind an enormous barricade of crap. The house was filled from floor to ceiling with crates and cartons, chandeliers, bowling balls, a horse-drawn carriage, human organs in jars, unfinished tapestries, tin cans, chairs, and bugles. If the bank wanted the brothers out, they'd have to get in. And then trapped tunnels that just might bring the whole horde down square on their heads. The door finally gave way, and the police waded waist-deep into piles of junk. But eventually, in the heart of the labyrinth, the cops found old Langley Collier. What is the meaning of this? Oh, the mortgage, yes. Why didn't you say so? I'll write you a check right now. Patting his pockets, he glanced around at the ceiling-high stack of objects all around him. Does anybody have a pen? Thanks so much to Doomlings for helping to make this episode possible. Please go check out their delightfully doomed card game that's been sitting at the top of my games pile for a few weeks now after the episode. Say, there goes old Herman Collier! Cried the people of New York in delight as the eccentric gynecologist made his way to work in the morning by paddling a canoe down the East River. Yeah, Herman was a character, but he and his people had been fixtures of New York society for centuries. The Colliers supposedly were descended from the Livingstons, who arrived in New York in the 17th century, making them cousins to the Astors, the Roosevelts, and the Hamiltons. Collier legend even had it that Queen Victoria had gifted a grand piano to Herman's wife Susie. Oh, and she came from a prominent family too. Hermans! Yeah, they were first cousins. Hey, when you got a classy New York dynasty going, do you really want some stranger doing a cannonball into the gene pool? Well, they sure didn't. And neither did their two sons, Homer and Langley, who pursued this line of thinking to its logical conclusion, extinction. At first, Homer and Langley looked to maintain the prestige of the cultivated Colliers. Both went to Columbia, where Homer studied maritime law and Langley engineering and chemistry. Taking after his mother, Langley was also a skilled concert pianist, even performing in Carnegie Hall. Yes, it was to be high society for the boys then, and they were well aware of their eminent origins. Langley once told the press that their ancestors came to America not on the Mayflower, but the Speedwell, a ship that carried a better class of passenger. The brothers also taught Sunday school, so come to think of it, they would have been well aware of Proverbs 16:18. Pride go before a consumption, and a haughty spirit before the fall. Tragically, they never saw this as particularly welcome. In 1909, flush, Herman, Susie, and the boys moved to a large brownstone in fashionable, well-to-do Homer at the time started. A decade later, Herman and Susie separated. Susie kept the house, and the children, grown men, stayed with her. After that, Herman passed away, leaving to his sons all of the artifacts of his medical practice, 15,000 textbooks among them. In 1929, Susie died as well, and for the first time in their 40s, Homer and Langley were home alone. But the New York that they knew, particularly the white, affluent Harlem they'd grown up in, was changing. When the Collier brothers came to Harlem in 1909, the neighborhood was about 10% black, but in 1930, it was 70%. That same decade saw, of course, the Great Depression, meaning in Harlem, 1 in 4 people were out of work. Now, regular viewers of our show might remember that this was also the time of the Harlem Renaissance, a foundational era of African-American art, music, and literature, which you can and should learn about more here. But I'm sure surprising few of you, turned out Herman and Susie Collier had not relocated the white, wealthy Collier dynasty to Harlem because of W.E.B. Du Bois' Manifesto for Black Theater. So as white Harlem receded, so too did the Collier brothers, deep into their own shared bubble. Then in 1933, Homer went blind, which made the metaphor of the Collier brothers' existence literal and complete. Unwilling and unable to perceive the world around him, Homer quit his law firm and withdrew into the house. Langley followed suit, leaving his job as a piano dealer to take care of Homer full-time. Langley cooked for Homer.
Welcome to Big Tobacco's Fantasyland, where vapes are deemed safer. Never mind, they can contain cancer-causing arsenic and lead.
read him Shakespeare and Dickens, and painted Homer's otherworldly visions of beautiful red buildings. We should note here that Langley was not a doctor, but did fancy himself more knowledgeable than any of them. I mean, was he not the son of a gynecologist? Did he not own 15,000 textbooks? No need for doctors, Langley thought. Homer's blindness could be cured with a simple diet of 100 oranges a week. This did not necessarily aid Homer's blindness. In fact, Homer eventually developed rheumatism, then paralysis. So by day, Langley tended to Homer. But at night, he left the house to dumpster dive for food and anything else that kind of looked cool. He was collecting textbooks, grand pianos, well, anything really. Oh, and a copy of each day's newspaper. He said he was saving these for Homer to read once he regained his sight. Ironically, the Colliers disappearing into the house had the effect of making them notorious. The aristocratic Harlem brothers holed up in a brownstone, hoarding pianos, food, blocks, cats, and guns. Unfortunately, the pressure on local teens to vandalize the house proved irresistible, and they attacked with rocks and jeers. In response, Langley boarded up the windows. But that didn't stop the odd teen or two from breaking in to look for hidden treasure. Drastic measures were called for. And so, from Langley's collection of wire, car parts, springs, and garbage, he outfitted the house with an elaborate network of booby traps and tunnels to catch would-be thieves. If an intruder stumbled over a tripwire, he'd be trapped and crushed. "All we want is for people to leave us alone," Homer told the press. Added Langley, "All people are after is money." Well, the phone company was after their money, that's for sure. See, having lost interest in paying their bills, the brothers' telephone was disconnected. "Oh, you can't imagine how free we feel," Langley said, followed by the discontinuation of their water, gas, and electricity. No matter, Langley boasted that, because of an inventive mind, he had devised a way to make his own electricity, but that this was, quote, too much trouble, and so he didn't do it very much. Once Langley paid off the mortgage, yeah, that scene from the beginning of the show actually does end with him paying it off. The brothers could really do whatever they wanted with the place. But only 5 years later, the police received a phone call about an ominous smell at the Collier house. After going through the whole thing with the door again, the police slowly pushed their way through 100 tons of banjos, bolts of silk, baby carriages, and horse cars to find the body of poor old Collier, dead for 10 hours from starvation. So densely packed was the house that the police had to send Homer out the window in a body bag, making him the first thing removed from that house in 2 decades. But what of Langley? He was nowhere to be found. He didn't even show up at Homer's funeral, held inauspiciously and somewhat rudely on April Fool's Day. Good Langley, after a lifetime at his brother's side, really have abandoned him. Worse, could he have murdered him? Had Langley become so thoroughly sick of people that not even his dear brother's company would keep? No, the reason police did not find Langley in the house is because it was a nightmare to find anything in that house. For weeks after Homer's death, the authorities made a diligent excavation of the Collier estate, ultimately to discover the body of Langley, lying only 10 feet from where Homer had died. Like some kind of fable, Langley had inadvertently tripped one of his own booby traps and been crushed to death in a tunnel by the same towers of crap he'd made to protect him and his brother from the fearsome world. It was actually Langley who died first, days before, leaving the paralyzed Homer helpless and by himself. Meaning, in a twisted sense of irony, they actually died how they fought so fervorously to live, left alone. Months after their deaths, the house was razed and a public park was built in its place. The Collier Brothers Park, as it's named, is there to this day. Though the park is not so much a tribute to the brothers, but an unintentional symbol of the life that they rejected. A place where all are welcome to sit and watch the world burn. But that's kind of the fascinating way history works, right? Something starts as one thing and then through a series of evolutions and catastrophes becomes something completely different. A process, come to think of it, I know the Doomlings would know a little something about. Wait, you know what a Doomling is, right? Well, okay, hold on, let me back up for a second. So you're sitting around your weekly gaming, but no one can decide what to play. Some are feeling a rules-heavy crunchathon. Some want a lighthearted minor story element type thing, and some just want the game to start before I have to go to bed because it's a work night. Well, I'm very glad that I have found something that everyone at my table is actually excited to play. Doomlings, a lighthearted cheesy card game that has the easy setup of Uno, the whimsical feel of Pokemon, and strategic components like Munchkin that keeps every type of player invested. That's because
the extra
That's because Doomlings focuses on having fun together. I know it's kind of a novel concept by playing cards to evolve the traits of these adorable little Doomlings over the ages. You know, before the world ends in catastrophe. They even have a Doomlings in 60 seconds video that can onboard everyone super fast so you can spend less time learning rules and more time Doomlinging, which is still a verb. I hold to that, just don't look it up. And now's the best time to pick up Doomlings for yourself, or give it as a gift this holiday season to the game lover in your life. I promise it'll be a little less chroma keyed when it gets to your house, because right now, for a limited time, if you head to Doomlings.com and use the code EXTRA20, you'll get 20% off your entire order. So click or scan here to invite the Doomlings into your gaming table, and then once you've played a trade or two, check out the next video here. What if I told you that Angela Valenciana, Arcalite Games, Dominic Valenciana, Foxdog, Hunter Z, Joseph Flame, Kuyakoya, and Ziliad Architectures were fantastic legendary patrons? Because it's true!
The extra historians! We finally meet! You know, I am a historian as well. I have read books.
The university students gather in the plaza, shouting, laughing, singing, as the chest-high pile of books burn. A brass band plays. Each volume has been labeled un-German, degenerate, or counter to Nazi ideals. Leftist texts, Marxist texts, feminine texts, plays and poetry by Jewish people, books by pacifists or that portray war negatively like All Quiet on the Western Front. They even burn Helen Keller's books, because those argue for the humanity of the disabled. But they also burn scientific and medical texts. They throw Einstein and Freud on fire, along with books by physician Magnus Hirschfeld, whose research library at his Institute for Sexual Research was the first ever burned. Mainstream science, the party believes, is too Jewish. The Nazis have their own science, you see. Science that is far more attuned to their beliefs. Weird science that's not really science at all. Thanks so much to Brilliant for continuing to support the learning of, you know, real science. When we last left off, Hitler had just entered the orbit of the German Workers' Party, a right-wing working class group formed by ex-Thule Society members. But he considered the party a bit of a joke, a committed atheist. He had little patience for the slipshod way it was run, and the absurd astrological and esoteric beliefs some of the members displayed, scoffing at the Thule Society as a tea club. Of course, that didn't mean he rejected their nationalism, anti-Semitism, and folkish ideas. In fact, his first notable act at a party meeting was to deliver a passionate and electrifying speech about the importance of uniting his native Austria and Germany into a greater political ethnic entity. And within the next few years, he rose in prominence, dispatching leadership rivals and centering more of the party's operations and goals around himself. Where have I seen that tactic recently? Anyway, yet in that time, when he ditched so many early aspects of the party and reinvented it, he never cleaned house on the occultists and astrologers who'd staffed its early membership. On the contrary, the party actually sponsored solstice festivals in 1920 and 1921, dedicated to Baldur the sun god and his son, Siegfried. The party newspaper ran articles claiming the cries of the Weimar Republic were foretold in Scandinavian sagas, and the newspaper's rhetoric increasingly spoke of communists as demons and Jews as vampires, trading on supernatural imagery. It intentionally courted and attracted the Ariosophists, adopting their eugenic tenets of protecting the Aryan race by banning interracial marriage, engaging in selective breeding, and eliminating or sterilizing racial or religious minorities and those with different bodies. All of this with the goal to create pure blood, which was really more of a spiritual concept than a scientific one, related to theorists who claimed humans were part animal, part angel, and that Nordic people had a greater proportion of angelic heritage, or else were part of a vanished alien super race from Atlantis. Now stopping for a second, if this all sounds a little sci-fi fantasy to you, there's actually a very good reason for that. See, Weimar Germany was awash in what we'd now refer to as pulp fantasy and science fiction, much of it involving tales of blonde Germanic supermen battling enemies clearly coded as leftist and Jewish, some of which took place in the ancient past, some in space. And as the party grew, it subsumed many of those writers into its propaganda machine, utilizing their sci-fi and horror talents into helping craft the image of the Nazi party and its foes. Granted, while many top-level leaders in the party, like Heinrich Himmler and Rudolf Hess, were very into occultism and astrology, Overall, Hitler wasn't terribly interested in that stuff, despite regularly calling on tradition and the values of an imaginary past. Again, he was an atheist and considered himself a modernist who was more interested in science, or rather, things that, appeared science. See, he wanted the appearance of harnessing cutting-edge technology, but in truth, largely rejected mainstream science. Because Nazi ideology held that science and academia was tainted by Jewish experts, Nazis instead rested on an alternate structure of pseudoscience and would have been called border sciences. Things that use the vocabulary of science, and that adherents claimed would be proven, but were in no way evidence-based. A great example is world ice theory that we mentioned last episode. The belief that the Earth had ice moons orbiting it in the past, and these had eventually smashed into the planet, triggering different epochs. As late as 1942, Hitler gave an interview personally endorsing the idea, going on to say that legends of cosmic cataclysms such as Atlantis or Norse tales of gods battling ice giants are only explicable if a disaster had destroyed an ancient culture with, quote, a high degree of human civilization. But this went far beyond world ice theory. The Nazis endorsed and even researched techniques such as dowsing, astrology, and homeopathy. In fact, many of these border sciences interacted with health, since along with science, they rejected mainstream medicine as well. This included stuff as wacky as magnetic therapy and spirit diagnosis, but also fairly reasonable practices like organic farming, anti-smoking campaigns, and vegetarianism. Yeah, Hitler's famous vegetarianism, this is where that comes from. They also threw money at researching techniques called esoteric farming. This was a precursor of organic farming created by the German theosophist Rudolf Steiner, who ironically fled Germany in fear of Hitler. Now, while esoteric farming included many aspects we'd recognize today, like refusing to use pesticides, it also suggested things like assisting plant growth with astrology, and advised burying a ram's horn stuffed with quartz crystal in the soil. In fact, remember how we talked last week about how folkish thinkers imagined a past where German peasants were mystically connected to their land? Well, Nazi thinkers actually fantasized about eventually recreating those communities and using esoteric farming techniques on land they'd conquered. But ultimately, the Nazis disliked and distrusted real science because it was based on the scientific method, a structure that, when used properly, does not conform to an ideological bias. University students, professors, and even many doctors were distrusted as secret communists, since many of these sectors had opposed the rise of fascism. Similarly, the Nazis drove out prominent Jewish and leftist academics, creating a brain drain that ensured the country's scientific strength was severely weakened. This had a particularly disastrous impact on German physics, since several prominent physicists like Albert Einstein and Max Born were Jewish. Ironically, the flight of German physicists would ensure that Nazi nuclear research lagged behind the Allies and mostly focused on reactors for generating power. However, border sciences, like world ice theory, were more malleable, easier to bring inside the fold, but still seeming in the moment enough to give a gloss of modernism. Remember, Hitler desperately wanted his regime to be seen as modern, and he was well aware that his anti-Semitic policies appeared medieval. Religious persecution, laws against intermarriage, and ghettos had quite literally been practiced for centuries in Central Europe, and internationally, they were called out as such. As a result, when trying to define Jewishness legally ahead of the Nuremberg laws, Hitler was desperate to find a standard other than religious practice that would separate Jews from Aryans. And he couldn't find one. From blood tests to facial measurements, it quickly became clear that there was no way you could just throw a measuring tape around someone's skull and tell biologically if they had Jewish heritage. He finally had to give up and simply make the test. Do you, or did any of your ancestors, practice the Jewish religion? And that, more than ever, exposes how Nazi radical ideology rested on pseudoscience, and what is at the bottom is really a supernatural belief rather than a scientific one. Well, that and how originally the Nazis spoke about Japan as part of the, quote, Asian horde that were trying to take over the world, but then when an alliance looked appealing, their propagandist explained that, oh, well, Actually, the Japanese are like the Aryans of East Asia and are totally part of the higher races as well. Yeah, that one caused some whiplash in and among the most indoctrinated Nazis. And the reason pop culture thinks of Nazi Germany as an era of not just science, but super science, is that their propagandists were so good at choosing projects that would impress and intimidate. The V-2 rocket, the battleship Bismarck, the first jet used in combat. Many of these were termed wonder weapons, stuff pulled directly from science fiction, which newspapers and radio broadcasts touted as being able to turn the tide of the war. Of course they couldn't. The Bismarck sank on its maiden voyage. V-2s were random, unguided weapons that terrified civilians, but had near-zero military utility. And the Me-262 jet? Well, America also had jets, but they weren't desperate enough to risk them being downed and captured. The German miracle weapons, by contrast, really existed largely as a way to convince the German public that their government was capable of great things, selling the myth of scientific achievement while ignoring the fundamentals. Ultimately, that tendency toward grandiose claims substituting for actual reality would arguably lose them the war, with Hitler getting high on his own supply, thinking that not only could he invade and occupy the Soviet Union, but simultaneously fight the United States as well. However, in this venture, science was not the only thing the Nazis would turn against. Plus, it's not like weird science is a thing of the past, right? Today, we're still inundated with bad sources informed more by ideologies than the scientific method, which is why, personally, when I'm looking to learn something new about science, math, data analytics, or programming, I turn to Brilliant. Brilliant is a learning platform where you learn by doing, with courses crafted by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from places like MIT, Caltech, Duke University, Microsoft, and Google, and you can learn on your own schedule anywhere you have the time. I've said this in the past, but I basically consider it like my anti-doom scrolling because I can just do it whenever I have 3 minutes, and I don't feel bad afterward. And I think Brilliant is super due to their critical principles approach, with interactive lessons designed to build up your critical thinking skills through problem solving and not just memorizing, which works way better for me. For instance, some of you may know that we just wrapped a Kickstarter for our history calendar, right? Well, what you may not know is that now we get to sort through thousands of orders of multiple bundles and add-ons to get the print run started on time and out. Correct. And thanks to my having completed thinking lessons like conditional statements and advanced loops, I was able to help Jeff and Kat out sorting the biggest spreadsheet I have ever seen in my entire life. And I was able to learn how to do it with fun multi-part lessons in my spare minutes, again on my phone. So if you want to up your game by learning something new or just brush up on some STEM that, may have gotten a little rusty on, you can try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/extrahistory or by clicking the link in the description, which, by the way, will also get you 20% off an annual premium subscription. So, what are you waiting for? You can become more brilliant by clicking here, and then once you've bettered your brain, check out another of our videos here. What if I told you that Angela Valenciana, Arclight Games, Dominic Valenciana, Fox Dog, Hunter C, Joseph Blame, Kuya Koya, and Ziliad Architectures were fantastic legendary patrons? Because it's true! April 1933. A police flashbulb lights the corpse, lying in a shallow grave southwest of Berlin. It's a male, shot once at close range. The victim is Eric Haynes, who has been missing for a week. A prominent clairvoyant and occultist, he'd been born to a Jewish family in Vienna before obscuring those origins to cozy up with the rising National Socialists. A close associate with the SA stormtroopers, his predictions had increasingly consisted of anti-Semitic pronouncements and visions of a coming Third Reich. His murder, officially unsolved, may have even been due to his greatest public prediction, that the Nazis would come to power after a fire at the Reichstag. A plan possibly divulged to him in advance by his brown shirt friends, and one they did not want public, giving all the more reason for a team of stormtroopers to, for example, gun the kidnapped psychic down in a lonely field. His death is estimated to have happened on March 25th, just after the Enabling Act granted Chancellor Hitler the power to rule free of constitutional constraints. The first victim in Hitler's war with occultism. Thanks so much to Saley for helping to keep us extra historians connected across the globe. Last episode, we explored the strange contradiction inherent in Nazi ideology. While it drew on symbols imported from Eastern religions, superstitious folklore, and even pagan and pre-Christian traditions, the movement also wanted to be perceived as rationalist and modernist. The irony there, of course, being that they also rejected science in favor of so-called border sciences that had not been proven, but Nazis believed would prove true with further research. Now, that doesn't mean that the Nazis tolerated occult practitioners. Remember, good National Socialists were supposed to reject superstition. Yet, for its first 4 years in power, Hitler's regime was surprisingly hands-off about the large number of self-proclaimed clairvoyants, graphologers, mediums, psychics, and astrologers who become so pervasive in the miasma of anxiety that pervaded Weimar Germany. Because the fact was, a lot of these folks saw the meteoric rise of the Nazi Party, especially after Hitler's imprisonment after the beer hall putsch made him a national celebrity, and started tailoring their predictions to forecast the movement's rise. Therefore, a lot of opportunistic occultists, as well as theosophists, Ariosophists, and those interested in resurrecting Germanic religion, were absorbed into the Nazi orbit. In fact, there were those who felt that Hitler was being too lenient on occultists, and began a personal crusade of debunking those they saw as superstitious frauds. Chief among them was Matilde Ludendorff, second wife of the World War I general Erich Ludendorff, who'd thrown his weight behind Hitler's beer hall putsch, then retired from public life after an unsuccessful run for president in 1925. A psychologist, Dr. Ludendorff became an opponent of occultism after treating several patients she believed had been negatively impacted by supernatural dogma. She and her circle published articles and books attacking occult practitioners, exposing frauds, and criticizing what she saw as faulty pseudo-history. Things like linking German Aryans with the Indo-Aryans of India, belittling those who used the swastika and tried to connect Siegfried with Buddha and Krishna. She also published exposés on how mediums faked spirit activity in seances and the psychological techniques clairvoyants employed to make it seem like they were reading clients. In fact, Eric Hauneson from the beginning of this episode was one of her favorite targets, at least until he turned up in a shallow grave. And if at this point you're thinking, oh man, finally a decent skeptic here, someone who's sensible and has her head on straight, well, not so fast there. See, one reason Dr. Ludendorff hated occultists so much was that she was a major promoter of the stab-in-the-back myth, an idea popularized by her husband that Germany only lost World War I because they were sabotaged on the home front by Jews, communists, pacifists, and, she argued, occultists. Yeah, see, Dr. Ludendorff was seriously anti-religion. And I mean like really, really anti-religion. For instance, she considered Christianity to be a fraud. She once called Jesus a Jewish trickster who never died on the cross, and said that the religion should be abandoned. In fact, she created her own polytheistic spiritual group known as the Society for Knowledge of a German God, attempting to resurrect German paganism. And in case you couldn't guess by now, her writings were also rabidly anti-Semitic. Then in the 1930s, she and her husband authored a series of increasingly unhinged books and pamphlets, insisting that occultists were secretly allied with Jesuits, Freemasons, Chinese magicians, Jews, the British royal family, African mystics, and socialists in a vast conspiracy to bring the German race down, all organized by their dark puppet master, a man controlling it all from his remote mountaintop palace, the Dalai Lama. Yeah, real tinfoil hat stuff. In fact, the Ludendorff's pamphlets were so insane that by the early 1930s, the Nazis, trying to appear more moderate after winning seats in the legislature, were distancing themselves from the couple. Do you know how batshit you have to sound for the Nazis? The Nazis to distance themselves from you? However, the Third Reich's policy towards occultists began to shift in 1937, when the Gestapo received an unsolicited report by a debunker requesting that they take a more vigorous role in suppressing so-called unscientific occultism, while still allowing qualified figures to work on astrology, border sciences, and associated research. The assault was multi-pronged, with the Gestapo surveilling occultist societies for any sign of communism, individualism, or forming international connections. Likewise, any leadership figures that appeared to have a charismatic sway over followers were intimidated into silence as a way to cut off rival leaders. Especially targeted were those whose predictions contradicted party dogma. This was accompanied by a public information campaign of lectures and articles condemning superstition and charlatanry, while claiming that occult practices were a secret attack on Germany by Jews and Freemasons. New laws criminalized commercial astrology and palm reading, and once the war began, astrological calendars were also banned due to the possibility of their use by the enemy in undermining morale. Meanwhile, a group of government-associated debunkers performed shows revealing the secrets behind everything from knocking at seances to contracts. And what followed was, well, something kind of right out of Arrested Development. The Reichs Artists Union filed a protest with the government, complaining that their debunkers were robbing stage magicians of their livelihoods by revealing the secrets behind magic tricks. Their art, they argued, was purely for entertainment and should not be punished along with psychics and mediums. This feud between the magicians and debunkers stretched for 2 years into 1941, and the magicians eventually triumphed when Hitler personally exempted them. After all, they were showing their patriotism by entertaining troops while giving on-stage disclaimers that nothing they did was supernatural. Then on May 10th, 1941, repressing occultism became a major priority, because on that day, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess climbed into an aircraft in southern Germany and flew alone to the UK. After crashing in a field in Scotland, he was quickly apprehended and turned over to British interrogators. Hess told them that he'd come to negotiate peace between Germany and the British Empire. See, with the coming invasion of the Soviet Union, Hess feared a two-front war and decided he'd stop it by unilaterally negotiating peace. In doing so, he hoped to make Hitler proud. Spoiler alert, Hitler was not proud. In fact, upon receiving Hess's letter explaining the action, he apparently screamed so loud that it echoed across his mountaintop vacation home. Something had to be done immediately to reassure the public and signal Italy and Japan that Hitler was not trying to make a separate peace with Britain. And the solution was to portray Hess as mad in the German press, driven insane by World War I wounds, and foolishly falling prey to astrologers and mediums. As part of that, Reinhard Heydrich, a major rival of Hess and anti-occultist, later known as Heinrich the Hangman, unleashed a countrywide operation called Action Hess that arrested hundreds of occultist practitioners, closed their publications, and confiscated thousands of books. This time, it was not just the commercial psychics, but also Ariosophists and Theosophists, those that shared Nazi radical beliefs. Hess's personal astrologer was imprisoned, while some went to concentration camps. They never saw it coming, noted propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels in his diary. Yet this repression was not the end of occult practice in Nazi Germany, because while the Gestapo and security service swept up targets, they found themselves stymied by senior figures who wanted to protect those that practiced, quote, scientific astrology, who had degrees or were performing, quote, important work on dowsing and discovering enemy ships via pendulum. Also, the occult books confiscated were not burned like the others, rather redirected into the library of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, because they were to be used in a grand project already underway. For in 1935, he had founded the Ahnen Erbe, a society for the study of German ancestral heritage, and they had dispatched teams of academics to places as far-flung as Tibet and the Crimea, looking to find and verify the imagined past of supermen that underpinned their racial ideology, attempting to not only prove that the Germans were the world masters, but that in ages past, the newly invaded lands of Eastern Europe had belonged to them. Which means, next episode, we'll be getting into what can only be described as Indiana Jones style. Now, if you are familiar with that series of films, you should remember two things. One, Indy punches just like a bunch of Nazis, and two, he does a lot of travel. And if, like Dr. Jones, you find yourself traversing the globe today just without that handy travel montage complete with Turning Red Line, then you will understand the benefits of a reliable internet connection while abroad. That was actually something I became painfully aware of last year when I was traveling in Germany. I got a bit lost outside of Lindau and was in desperate need to contact my friends, but because I didn't have the right eSIM, I couldn't make a call or send a text or even use Google Maps. So when Saley, a new eSIM service app, reached out to sponsor an episode, I can really only say I wish they'd contacted us sooner. For the uninitiated, an eSIM provides internet connection whenever you're traveling and saves you money on roaming fees. And with Saley, it's never been easier to get service in over 160 countries and 8 regions. It's as easy as downloading their app, choosing which plan is right for your travels, and then applying our code EXTRAHISTORY to get an exclusive 15% off discount. Saely is compatible with iOS and Android phones, has 24/7 customer support, and can be downloaded before you go, so your connection is all set the moment you land wherever. So please don't be like 1 year ago, Matt. Be more like right this very moment, Matt, and scan the QR code here to download the Saely app and use the code EXTRAHISTORY at checkout to save some bank while never having to hunt for public Wi-Fi again. Or you can, click here to get Saely if you want to let your mouse do the talking, and then once you're set to jet, no matter where you are, why not check out our next video here? Oh my god, I'm so glad I caught you. Did you know that Angelo Valenciana, Argolite Games, Dominic Valenciana, Fox Doc, Hunter Z, Joseph Blaine, Kuyakoi, and Ziliad Architectures were the best legendary patrons? Well, now you do. SS School, Vivelsburg Castle, September 1939. Edmund Kiss enters the office, his briefcase full of maps and his head full of ideas. For soon, he will embark on a monumental archaeological endeavor funded by the Nazis. Just over a decade ago, he'd personally financed an expedition to the Bolivian Andes. That mission was to see whether settlers from Thule, the supposed ancient Atlantis of Nordic supermen, had crossed the ocean and constructed buildings erroneously attributed to the Inca. There, at Tiwanaku, he'd marveled at the gateway of the sun and its symbols. So much like Stonehenge, so much like runes, and determined it included a European-style 12-month calendar. But the academic world laughed at his theories. They mocked the historical fiction novels he'd written based on his research, where muscular German demigods in the ancient past battled lesser races to defend Atlantis. They're not gonna laugh anymore. Kiss is going back. The SS has agreed to fund his year-long expedition with 20 experts who will chart the site with aerial and underwater photography. A dig that will finally prove that he is not the idiot everyone says he is. Except it won't. Because this meeting is to tell him that Germany has invaded Poland and his expedition has been canceled. Thanks so much to Nebula for helping to make this episode possible. And once you've finished here, you can check out our final episode in this series entitled Thor's Hammer, which is live right now over on Nebula before anywhere else, and you can see it at nebula.tv/extrahistory. If you've seen the Indiana Jones films, then you've come across the idea of Nazis racing across the world from Nepal to the Middle East, excavating sites and trying to grab artifacts. Which is true. Sort of. See, Nazi archaeology projects were all about prestige and less about precision. Because, and I know this is going to sound nuts, Nazis really wanted to be liked. The idea of respect, legitimacy, and image was super important to them, especially internationally, which, as you can imagine, created a bit of a problem. Because a central claim of their ethos was that Germans were genetically superior and special, that they had invented writing, architecture, and all-world culture, and depending on who you asked, were the descendants of supermen who dispersed across the world from their Atlantean homeland of Thule, which then sank. And these ideas were not exactly supported by mainstream archaeology, history, or science. In fact, most academics, both within Germany and internationally, call these ideas idiotic. Which was of why in 1935, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, founded the Ahnenerbe. Its mission, to find proof of this glorious past, validate National Socialist theories, and communicate it all to the German people through publications, lectures, and film. Though this wasn't the first historical research group associated with the SS, the organization already had a section called the, quote, Race and Settlement Office that focused on vetting the genealogy of SS members' potential spouses to ensure they had no Jewish ancestry. And even in the early 1930s, Himmler was handing out positions in that office to scholars and border science figures who espoused his blood and soil idea. A lot of them crackpots and weirdos. And in fact, probably the best way to look at the extremely broad work of the Ahnenerbe is through a tour of these crackpots and weirdos, taking a look at what they believed and the official support that they garnered. First up is Karl Maria Willigott, an Austrian occultist and former soldier who Himmler encountered in 1933. Willigott claimed to be a descendant of a long line of mystics dating back to the primordial times described in Nordic myths, where giants and dwarves walked the earth. In his writing, he supposedly remembered lore passed down from his grandfather, unveiling survivals of a pre-Christian German paganism stamped out by the Catholic Church. A legacy, he said, allowed him to read minds and see visions. Willigut supposedly recommended the SS Wewelsburg Castle as its training center, where Himmler assembled a personal collection of German artifacts sourced from museums. He also advised Himmler on what symbols and runes to use in its interior decorations, as well as those used on German military graves. He claimed to have discovered new runes in a vision, but actually stole them from another occultist. Who'd thought? He even designed the rings Himmler gave out to favored subordinates and made expeditions to help uncover surviving aspects of his claimed Proto-Germanic religion. At least he did until 1948, when Himmler learned that Willigut had spent several years involuntarily committed to a mental health facility. As a result, Himmler quietly retired Willigut to put his focus on more serious scholars. For example, the Witch Division, a group that attempted to reconstruct pre-Christian paganism by a close reading of Roman accounts, witch trials, and medieval persecutions for heresy. Alongside him here was Otto Hra, who was obsessed with tying the concept of the Holy Grail to pre-Christian stories of a sun god, while claiming it also tied into survivals of ancient Aryan beliefs in Tibetan Buddhism, which also has ritual cups. Boom! Mic drop, Buddha confirmed German, case closed. Meaning basically that Indiana Jones had the whole thing slightly skewed. Work conducted under the Race and Settlement Office and later the Anan Eva was not focused on grabbing Judeo-Christian religious artifacts. Rather, it all came back to world ice theory and resurrecting an imagined pre-Christian religion. The Third Reich's archaeological, linguistic, historical, geological, anthropological, and even musicological investigations under the Anan Eba were all about trying to use scientific means to prove Aryans had started world culture by dispersing from Thule, again the Aryan Atlantis. And they spent a huge effort on this. In the first expedition in 1935, Anan Eba investigators entered a remote area of northern Finland to interview the residents, filming folk rituals and songs, which was interesting ethnographically, but the team's claims that they'd found evidence of pre-Christian survivals was total nonsense. The next year, the head of the Anan Eba studied prehistoric petroglyphs in Sweden, making similar illogical claims that they were the first language. Another expedition essentially used organizational funds to force sites in Eurasia and the Middle East, probably as cover for espionage. Its geologists also accompanied the Third Nazi Antarctic expedition to photograph and map the Scandinavian Antarctica, while other scholars visited museums across Europe to study artifacts the Anan Eba would later loot during the war. Many of these studies were linguistic in nature, studying petroglyphs in hope of proving that writing had been invented in Northern Europe rather than Mesopotamia. Yet the most prominent effort was the 1938 Tibet expedition, led by the 27-year-old ornithologist Ernst Schaefer, though exactly how much the Anan Eba sponsored it is up for debate. See, Schaefer was a real zoologist and had conducted 2 other expeditions to the region. Fearing for his scientific reputation, he accepted Himmler's patronage, but not Anan Eba funds, which were exhausted by this time anyway, and rejected any involvement from the infamous crackpot we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, Edmund Kiss. However, he did accept Himmler's conditions that all expedition members would join the SS, that he met with Willigut before the expedition, who claimed to be Schaefer's mind, and agreed to investigate Nazi theories about Aryan survival groups in the Netherlands. One team member was an anthropologist, Bruno Beer, who specialized in, quote, race science. Additionally, the whole thing would be documented on film and produced as a propaganda document. Also, they came by invitation from the government of Tibet, who were frightened by the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937 and were looking for allies. But then again, Schaefer's team weren't exactly politically neutral either. While conducting geological surveys and collecting samples of plants, animals, and grain, they also scoped out routes they could use into British India should war break out. Meanwhile, Bruno Beer surveyed the Tibetans themselves, taking skull measurements via calipers and tape measures, making handprints and taking facial casts, hoping to discover some similar genetic subtypes that would suggest a common ancestor with modern Germans. The expedition met with government existing digs funded within Germany itself. After all, a few mainstream archaeologists were only too happy to take advantage of this new interest in the field. And while some of these did yield results, they were, well, normal archaeological results, and not proof of Aryan supermen. Himmler, however, always ready to make a mountain out of a molehill, touted them all as revolutionary. So much so that he actually gave Hitler a leather-bound copy of Anna Eva Research for his birthday. Hitler was unimpressed. How could he take pleasure in the fact that Germanic people were turning clay pots when the Greeks were building the Acropolis? Other expeditions were planned to Iceland, the Canary Islands, Iran, and Kiss's Bolivian venture, but were cancelled at the outbreak of war. Though the war itself would not stop all the Anna Eva activities, because with the invasion of Poland and the expansionism of Operation Barbarossa, a new and horrifying chapter of the organization began. For Himmler had very specific plans for those grain samples Schaefer had brought back from Tibet. They were supposed to be the basis of hardy new grain fields that would be planted across Crimea and the Ukraine that, once wrested from the Soviet Union, would be resettled with German agricultural communities using esoteric farming. And Anna Eva archaeological research would not only prove, he thought, that those lands were not only part of the ancient Aryan dominion. His, quote, racial experts would determine which of the people living there would be resettled and which would be exterminated. Once again, thank you so much to Nebula for supporting us in our creation of this series. We know all too well that sometimes when you make YouTube stuff and it has its policy of maximizing advertiser-friendly content, it can make it challenging to show you guys videos that deal with difficult yet important moments in history. So when we spend months on research, writing, reporting, and animating our shows, we are incredibly thankful that we can guarantee you'll always get to see them in their entirety on our independent creator-owned streaming service. Actually, speaking of that, you can now watch the 5th and final episode in our Nazi Occultism series entitled Thor's Hammer right now before it's available anywhere else on Netflix. Berlin, March 30th, 1945. Heinrich Himmler realizes the Allies are closing in and everything is falling apart. The world ice theory experts had underestimated the Russian winter. His revolutionary project to use dowsing and pendulum mineral deposits and find Allied ships in the Atlantic have failed. And even his project to find the secret of Thor's hammer has yielded no results. So he sent orders to destroy Castle Hill before the Americans can take it. But the lack of explosives means the SS can only collapse the towers. As the demolition team retreats, local villagers surge in to pillage what's left of the castle's interior. They trudge through Himmler's museum of prehistoric artifacts and rooms where SS officers have conducted marriage rituals before boot camp and christened newborn babies by touching them with a dagger. They loot plates with rune markings and open a room filled with skeletons, each belonging to a dead SS officer. It's ready to the beat of Soviet artillery. Thanks so much to Incogni for helping us tell important historical stories while also keeping people's personal data personal. As Germany plunged deeper and deeper into the Second World War, the seeds of their occultism, superstition, and reliance on pseudoscience increasingly came back to bite them. The Anna Eva had turned from its pre-war mission to exploring ancient culture and attempting to prove French racial histories, and instead concentrated on military projects. As early as 1940, Heinrich Himmler contacted Anna Eva researchers, telling them to find any mention in ancient art or folklore of Thor's hammer Mjolnir and its ability to shoot lightning. I am convinced, he wrote, that this is not based on natural thunder and lightning, but rather that it is an early, highly developed form of war weapon of our forefathers. That it was only wielded by the gods, he reasoned, quote, implies an unheard of knowledge of electricity. Then swinging back to 1944, and things looking increasingly dire for Germany, he returned to the pipe dream, forming an Anna Eva think tank to create a new Thor's hammer, a theoretical EMP that would interfere with or destroy Allied electrical equipment. Needless to say, after several weeks, they concluded this was not feasible with the current level of technology, and other projects in involving dowsing, pendulums, clairvoyance, and ESP research failures. A breeding program attempting to produce a new generation through selectively breeding SS men with genetically vetted women was, to put it mildly, not replacing the current generation of Germans being killed at the front or in bombing raids. But the Anaheim were doing other things, far darker things, to support both the war and the new world the Nazis were trying to build. So a quick content warning here. If you'd like to skip those specifics, please jump to the time code on screen. After taking Crimea in Operation Barbarossa, Himmler put his scholars to work. Dig teams went out to survey the and archaeological sites in the region to support the political claim that the Crimean Peninsula fell within the German homeland in ages past. The groups of people living in the area would either be forcibly resettled or liquidated by death squads in order to clear the living space so the Reich could set up idealistic farming communities growing grain using seed stocks brought back from Tibet. Yet who exactly should be killed was difficult to determine. Central Europe, it turned out, contained a frankly dizzying amount of ethnic identities and people groups, many of which overlapped with each other. So on an EO academics went with their calipers and tape measures to try to determine who would be killed. Though the darkness did not end there. With the death camps in full swing, the Anan Iba oversaw horrific human medical experiments. In one of their many evil acts, they selected 86 Jewish men, women, and children from Auschwitz based on what they considered, quote, representative skeletal characteristics, then murdered them in a gas chamber in order to display their skeletons in an anthropological exhibit. The goal here was to display them in a museum and have interpretive materials that explained how Jewish people were, quote, subhuman and biologically different from Aryans. Bruno Biega, the anthropologist and race science specialist from the Tibet expedition, was the one who conducted the skull measurements and helped select the victims. He was also the only prominent member of the project who would not be sentenced to death for his involvement. Rather, he served 3 years in prison and died in 2009. This was not the only time that anthropology and archaeology played a role in the Holocaust, though. In addition to the Anan Iba plundering museums and private galleries across France for supposedly German artifacts like the Bayeux Tapestry, the organization seized hundreds of religious objects from Jewish communities, and regional occupation authorities did the same. In fact, the Jewish Museum in Prague offered to do this themselves, ostensibly to help the Nazis value them, but actually as an act of resistance, documenting Jewish religious life in Prague so that it would be preserved even after both the community and eventually museum staff were murdered. Remember what I said at the beginning of this series, that just because someone's ridiculous doesn't mean they're not dangerous? All of this absurd stuff about Atlantean supermen, werewolves, ice moons crashing into the earth, bad archaeology, and ancient Germans building Inca ruins, all of it leads here. And sometimes the connection is really direct. At one of the first meetings of the Anan Iba, Himmler began discussing prehistoric bog bodies discovered in Scandinavia and claimed without evidence that they had been executed due to being gay. And that then became part of his justification for sending LGBT people to the death camps, him claiming it was a tradition practiced by their earlier, purer ancestors. But we should also stop and make a different point here. None of this explains Nazi Germany as a whole. The Third Reich didn't get to the extremes it did simply because its leaders were into alternative religions. In fact, while many leading Nazis were into this stuff, paganism had limited appeal among the rank and file. For example, the attempt to reshape Germany by eclipsing Christianity with a paganistic National Socialism met with resistance. While a few hundred ritual weddings took place, and a few dozen babies were christened by touching them with a dagger as an officer read a poem dedicating them to the state, this was generally SS stuff. In fact, even they had to keep it quiet, since even Hitler had told Himmler to knock off the cult behavior. After all, the majority of Germans, including SS men, were Protestant and Catholic. And some of this neo-pagan stuff might have had some appeal with the public, but very few of them were willing to jettison Christianity wholesale. Hitler, again, despite his atheism, still often invoked God and Jesus in his speeches. And while they made some inroads into incorporating Nazi imagery into Christmas, their attempts to replace St. Nicholas with Wotan, move the holiday to the solstice, and remove references to Jesus from Christmas carols was met with an unusual amount of pushback. Also, it should be noted that it wasn't like Germany was alone in entertaining strange beliefs, including racial ones. Theories about ancient tribes of white people starting all-world culture were all the rage in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was big in theosophy, and even had echoes in Mormonism. I mean, let's not also forget that the American troops who landed at Normandy were not only a segregated military, but carried segregated supplies of blood plasma. Because, at the time, we harbored some of those same semi-magical beliefs about the purity of blood. And many of those American soldiers would have balked at getting plasma from a black person. Any historical work on the Pacific War also runs into the uncomfortable territory of Americans speaking about the Japanese as subhuman. Hell, we even had our own mad scientists. In 1942, Japanese-American soldiers from the 100th Battalion were ordered to an island off Mississippi where they were hunted with dogs in a failed attempt to train them to smell Japanese soldiers. And far stranger things were happening during the Cold War. Now, this is obviously not to suggest an equivalency with the Nazis, not at all. Just that this sort of counter-magical thinking about race, heritage, and history was widespread, though only in Germany did it become so thoroughly baked into government. And there are lots of reasons why that happened. In fact, there are whole libraries of books trying to explain this, so that why look at it specifically through the lens of occultism? Well, think about it this way. Have you ever been to the ophthalmologist? When they test your eyes, they show you a picture, then change the lens and ask which is clearer. Then they get a new lens, and again with the lens being clearer. Then they put all those lenses together, and the picture comes out. In history, that's how you use theory. Well, occultism is just one lens, one aspect to layer onto the others, like economic history, trauma, First World War, feminist theory, the role of class, or Germany's very rich history of anti-Semitic violence. Then when you use several of these lenses together, that picture becomes clearer. So this series is just a piece of that. But when it happens, in that clarity, you get a better idea of how dangerous some of these laughable, silly, and yes, deeply weird ideas are. That racist conspiracy theories, imagined enemies, and subordination of science to the party line is a truly dark path for any country to walk. Once again, thank you so much to Incogni for believing that sharing stories from our past will help ensure a brighter future. But you know what they actually don't believe in? Well, that would be bad actors sharing your personal data. Until we started working with Incogni, I actually had no idea how much of my personal information was being sold and published by data brokers online without me even knowing it. Not to mention, data breaches leaking our personal information saw a yearly uptick of 41.5% worldwide, according to the Identity Theft Research Center, which is just such a fun stat. And your data being sold or stolen can lead to any number of issues, ranging from the annoyance of like constant robocalls all the way up to catastrophic stuff like identity theft. But now with Incogni, we are not alone, because after a very speedy sign-up, they got to work bombarding these data brokers and people search sites with takedown notices to remove my personal info. Plus, they do keep the pressure on using regional law and ordinances to make sure my data stays removed even when new sites pop up. And I get to keep track of it all through their real-time dashboard and email alerts. Like this week, my report showed that my personal data had now been scrubbed from over 262 sites, and they're working on a ton more. So if you want to keep your personal data, your personal data, you can get 60% off Incogni right now by visiting incogni.com/extrahistory and using our code extrahistory. Or you can click or scan right here to get started, and then once you've ruined a data broker's day, please check out another of our videos here. Thanks so much to Angela Valenciana, Arclight Games, Dominic Valenciana, Fox.com, Joseph Lane, Kuyakoi, and Soviet Architectures for being awesome legendary patrons.
Hey there, extra historians. Welcome to Live, the show where we tell you all the things we left out, the stuff we got wrong. We're going to try and fit a giant gold YouTube plaque into a Hong Kong apartment. Why are you so big, YouTube plaque? You are already so gold. You're not lazy.
Hungary, 1474. The artist's hands shake as he sets up his easel and paints. Across from him sits a man infamous throughout the land. Some call him a hero, the only man who could defend Eastern Europe from the armies of the Ottoman say he's a monster, a fiend, who impales men, women, and children on long spikes and feasts beneath their journeys. And according to one story, he dips his bread in the warm blood that splatters his plate. This legend in front of the artist has a face that matches the stories, a sharp nose, heavy eyebrows, and bulging green eyes. For over a decade, the man has been a captive here, but soon he'll be unleashed again. Vlad III, son of the dragon, Dracula. Though before we take a bite out of this legendary tale, we want to thank Nebula for helping to make this episode possible. And remind you that after this episode, you should go check out our next extra history series on Nazi occultism over there, a full week earlier than anywhere else by clicking the link below. Welcome, friends! Today, we will be discussing Vlad the Impaler, aka Dracula, a 15th century Romanian ruler who... Vlad, I'm doing a bit. Alright. Take the bangs out. Kinda hurt anyway. Actually, it's for the best, because as fun as it is to make vampire jokes, the true story of Vlad the Impaler is actually more interesting, revealing, and dare I say funny, than the literary counterpart that stole his name. Vlad III, later known as the Impaler, is by far the most famous Romanian historical figure. But he's famous, in a strange sense, in his own right. He's a national hero, seen as a champion of independence and resistance against Ottoman expansion. But outside Romania, he's mostly famous as the psychopath and sadist that inspired Bram Stoker's. In fact, word of his violent deeds spread even during his lifetime, as printmakers in Germany churned out exaggerated or invented stories about him. In other words, centuries before Stoker's birth, Vlad's story was already intertwined with him, which makes him difficult to talk about. So just to state this up front, our plan with this series is to first discuss the historical Vlad, and then do a separate episode on the complex legacy of his memory, where yes, we promise we'll talk about all the Dracula stuff. Because actually, Dracula is Rob's favorite classic novel, and we did an entire episode on that book on our literary show, So You Haven't Read. It's awesome, I love it, and you should definitely go take a bite out of that after you finish learning about Vlad here. But okay, back to history. To understand Vlad the man, we have to go back to the time of his father, Vlad II, known as Dracul, or the Dragon. Vlad Dracul got that name after Sigismund, king of Hungary, and later the Holy Roman Emperor made him a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order that vowed to defend Eastern Europe from the Ottoman Empire. These two, they were close. See, Vlad II grew up as a hostage at Sigismund's court, a common practice then, which was half like going to boarding school and half like, well, being a hostage. Vlad's father, the ruling prince of Wallachia, had agreed to be a vassal of the Hungarian king, with Vlad living within decapitating distance of the Hungarian throne to keep his father honest, i.e., betray me and I kill your kid. Yet Sigismund was pretty chummy with Vlad, educating him and showing him favor, because Sigismund's ideal outcome wasn't for Vlad to die, it was for him to succeed his father and rule Wallachia as a close ally of Hungary. But why? I mean, why would Hungary, much larger than it is today, put so much effort into controlling a relatively small principality? Well, as they say in real estate, location, location, location. Wallachia was, essentially, the buffer zone for a major conflict brewing in Eastern Europe. The expansionist Ottoman Empire had rolled over the Balkans, and the then powerful Kingdom of Hungary wanted a friendly ruler in Wallachia to keep it free of Ottoman control and the famous Ottoman Janissaries off Hungary's borders. But the throne of Wallachia was a bit of a mess, and keeping anyone on it was a big project. Vlad Dracul's own father had been prince twice before he died in 1418, and 5 other of Vlad's cousins and half-brothers had also sat on the throne by 1436, some multiple times. That's because monogamy was more of a suggestion for Wallachian nobles rather than a strict rule, and that created an enormously twisted family tree of backstabbing and usurpation that meant the average time on the throne during Vlad Dracul's lifetime was only around 2 to 3 years. But it wasn't until 1434 that Sigismund thought about a regime change. That's of course when one of Vlad's brothers, currently the prince, sent envoys to pledge allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II. In response, Sigismund gave Vlad a bunch of money to raise an army of exiled Wallachian boyars, basically the noble class, to seize the throne. He succeeded in 1436, mostly because his brother died of an illness, and Vlad's first act was to cancel the unratified treaty his predecessor had drawn up with the Ottomans. Then, 2 things happened. First, the Ottomans invaded in response, then a month later, Sigismund died, triggering a Hungarian internal crisis that meant Wallachia wasn't going to be getting any of its promised military aid. So, Vlad Dracul decided to forego that whole Order of the Dragon, Battle the Turks thing, pledged fealty to Murad II, and guided an Ottoman army into Hungary. But that Ottoman force was defeated, leaving the Hungarians with Vlad. See, the problem that would bedevil Vlad, and his son Dracula as well, was that Wallachia was a small country between big powers. And siding with one invited the other to either attack him militarily or to try to put another relative on the Wallachian throne. In 1442, Vlad took a meeting with John Hunyadi, a Hungarian vassal and Prince of Transylvania, remember him, who convinced Vlad to withdraw his support from a planned Ottoman invasion of Transylvania. Vlad, hoping to stay neutral, didn't join the invasion, but did let Murad's forces to attack Hunyadi. Now, it was Murad II who was furious with Vlad, and when he called him in for an explanation, he jailed him along with his two youngest sons, both releasing him to reclaim his throne once he swore not to act against Ottoman interests, and pledged to send 500 children to join the elite Ottoman champion. But when he was released from Ottoman custody, he left a few things behind, namely his 11-year-old son Vlad, known by his familiar Ottoman name of Dracula, or Son of the Dragon. Oh, that's right. Just like Daddy Dragon got ditched as a hostage at Sigismund's court, this little dragon got left as a hostage to the Ottomans along with his brother Radu. And these two brothers couldn't admit it. Radu got along just fine and young. He was just eventually even earning the title Radu the Handsome. He befriended the Sultan's son Mehmed II, and his studies in Turkish, the Quran, logic, mathematics, and philosophy flourished. Vlad, on the other hand, didn't get on so well. Neither charming nor handsome, he got none of the fawning attention Radu received, and his defiant attitude meant he regularly felt the lash of a tutor's whip. Yet while they were generally well treated, they were also in danger. A fact brought home when the brothers saw two boys, fellow Eastern European hostages, blinded with red-hot irons as punishment for communicating with their father. As always, Vlad's bulging green eyes saw everything. He saw the Ottoman court, memorizing its functions and ways. He observed military drills close up and was raised along with Mehmed, gaining first-hand knowledge of a future enemy. He observed the terror tactics the Ottomans used to keep vassals and populations in line, and he learned another hard lesson, that politics wasn't personal. Betraying your family was okay if it gave you more power. Then one day, a messenger arrived, saying that Vlad and Radu's privileges were being stripped. They would now live in harsher conditions, separated from the court. For it seems their father, the dragon, knowing it would mean the death of his sons, had joined John Hunyadi in a crusade to eject the Ottomans, which didn't go very well. The Crusaders marched to total defeat, and then in the fallout, Vlad Dracul gave confusing signals of which side he was actually on. But ultimately, he resubmitted himself as a vassal to Sultan Murad, allowing Vlad Dracula and Radu, who he was surprised to learn were still alive, to come home. And as I'm sure you can imagine right now, in making this peace, Vlad Dracul had invited war. Because now John Hunyadi stormed into Wallachia, hoping to put a pretender named Vladislav on the Wallachian throne. Because this story really needed more guys named Vlad. Vlad Dracula and Radu the Handsome fled back to the Ottomans, while their eldest brother, who stayed to fight for their father, got caught by a group of rebel boyars, who blinded him with a red-hot poker and buried him alive. And days later, Hunyadi and his men ran down Vlad II. The dragon was killed, his throne given to Radu, which meant that now, in 1448, it was likely to bring out Vlad to enter Wallachia and reclaim the throne. So with military support from the Ottoman Sultan, the son of the dragon marched to his revenge, and Dracula was unleashed. Ottoman Empire, 1447. This is how Romanian folk was set to happen. When Vlad Dracul was being run out of the march, when he knew that he crossing rivers until he entered the Ottoman Empire and presented them to Vlad Dracula. And as the boyar recounted the deaths of his father and brother, Dracula stood staring at the sword and pendant, both given to his father by Sigismund, both marked with the iconography of the Order of the Dragon. And there, the 17-year-old Vlad Dracula swore that he would not rest until he had avenged his murdered kin, and that he would personally, with his own hand, slay the pretender Vladislav. While the story we started with may be folklore, it does capture a solid truth. When John Hunyadi's invasion killed Vlad's father and brother, it put the teenage hostage into play. Murad seems to have told Vlad the death himself, and then followed it up by making him an officer in the Ottoman military. Because despite the greater popularity of his younger brother Radu, Vlad's seriousness and determination had convinced Sultan Murad that this was the prince they wanted ruling Wallachia as an ally. And considering how brutally Hunyadi and his allies had killed Vlad's family, Murad also assumed that any chance of the young prince defecting to the Hungarians was most likely buried alive with Vlad's older brother. Plus, it was the perfect time to reclaim Wallachia for the Dracul dynasty. For when John Hunyadi and Vladislav marched into Ottoman-held Serbia, Murad had dealt them a shattering defeat outside Kosovo. In fact, the rout was so chaotic that no one even knew if Hunyadi or Vladislav had survived. Seeing his chance, Vlad stormed into Wallachia with a Turkish cavalry force and seized the throne, a dramatic beginning to a powerful and bloody reign. Soon, Vlad would take revenge on the boyars who had betrayed his father and brother, and would carve a swath across all of the land of oops, sorry. Funny story, Vladislav actually turned up, both very alive and with an army, recaptured the throne, and sent Vlad back into exile. His first reign lasted all of 2 months. At first, he fled back to the Ottomans, but things weren't safe there either. Vladislav, though he'd accepted Hunyadi's help to be installed on the throne of Wallachia under the explicit agreement that he'd fight the Turks, was discovering the same thing Vlad's father had. Wallachia simply couldn't survive against the Ottomans without Hungarian aid, and Hungary was a mess. Soon Wallachian boyars pressured him to make peace with the Sultan. So he sent envoys to Sultan Murad looking to strike a deal. And Vlad, rightfully worried his death might be a condition of the bargain, fled to Moldavia. And Vlad received a warm welcome there. For that year, his uncle had become the ruler of Moldavia, and his cousin Stephen the heir apparent. And the 3 years that Vlad spent there, connecting with his cousin and getting a Renaissance education, were likely some of the happiest of his life. He even got a taste of military glory, helping his uncle and cousin turn back a Polish force. Good days. Though the time was abruptly cut short when his uncle's half-brother assassinated him, and Vlad and Stephen both fled to Hungary, where he was forced to play cat and mouse with John Hunyadi, going from town to town, hiding with sympathetic boyars, and at one point slipping away just as a squad of ambushers tried to catch and assassinate him. Then everything changed again. First, Sultan Murad died, and in his place rose his more vigorous and ambitious son Mehmed, who declared it his top priority to finally conquer Constantinople. A goal made possible since while the city was still a trade center and symbolically important, it had declined in military power. Hunyadi's star was falling as well. While he was still revered as the most famous crusader against the Turks, his 2 recent defeats had tarnished his reputation. I mean, a few years before, he'd essentially ruled Hungary on behalf of a child king, but now he was back to just being a plain old prince of Transylvania. And then Vladislav, well, Vladislav was aligning ever closer with the Ottomans, meaning Hunyadi was suddenly shopping for a new prince of Wallachia, which set up an interesting space for an approach between Hunyadi and Vlad, because each did have something the other wanted. Hunyadi could give Vlad legitimacy, official recognition in Hungary, and a path to reclaim his throne. In turn, Vlad could give Hunyadi an able partner who knew the Ottoman military and leadership from the inside, and who could replace Vladislav if necessary. Striking this deal, however, meant that Vlad would need to join the man who'd slaughtered his family. But in an ironic twist, Vlad's father of all people had prepared him for this decision back when he'd abandoned Vlad as a hostage with the Ottomans. Politics was inevitable, and if reclaiming his throne meant foregoing vengeance, then so be it. Vlad became a noble at Hunyadi's court, and his new patron took him to the coronation of the new Hungarian king, Ladislaus the Posthumous, where he took an oath, formally, to act as an ally of Hungary and the Catholic Church. His role would be the same as his father's, halting the Ottomans' advance and reclaiming Christian lands. And with his oath sworn, the Hungarian Diet charged Vlad with defending the Transylvanian frontier against the Ottomans and their Wallachian allies. A duty his father also held. News of Constantinople's fall in 1453, while no surprise, did sour the celebrations. Stories had filtered in that the Ottomans had impaled prisoners in front of the city walls, a punishment used by both Hunyadi's forces reached Belgrade just as the besieged city was ready to fall, broke through the Turkish lines, and managed to get inside the citadel to reinforce the beleaguered garrison. They broke the siege, repelling Mehmed's forces after weeks of combat. Hunyadi, the White Knight who had fought the Ottomans for decades, had relieved Belgrade, an event described as a miracle. But a miracle that went sour, as plague swept into his camp, killing Hunyadi and the expedition's other leader. But Vlad Dracula had little time to warn the enemy-turned-mentor, for his goal had been to tie up Vladislav's forces, and he knew the best way to do it: invasion. As he crossed into his homeland, he looked up to see a fell star burning in the heavens. Ollie's Comet, a celestial body that people across the world interpreted as either a sign of impending catastrophe or great events. And meeting his enemy's army outside the Wallachian capital of Dracovista, Vlad took the burning star as a sign of coming victory. We know little about what happened next. According to one story, the relatively small armies clashed, but in another, the forces decided to settle the issue by single combat. Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, against his cousin Vladislav, Prince of Wallachia. Though in both versions, Vlad slays the pretender with his own hand. When he took the throne, his coins were stamped with the five-tailed comet, the symbol of his victory. But that victory was glorious, because while he agreed to pay Mehmed 2,000 gold as tribute and agreed to let the Ottoman armies cross his lands, these agreements were only to buy time for him to build and repair more fortresses and solve internal problems at home. For the faction of boyars who had brought him to the throne were a small minority of the nobility. Most had supported the slain Vladislav, including those who had risen up and killed Vlad's brother at the prompting of John Hunyadi. Indeed, it was only months into his second reign when a young boyar raised an army of mercenaries to dethrone the young prince. But Vlad ambushed the little man as they marched toward Targovishta and made an example of him no one would miss. His troops sharpened long sticks, greased them, and then shoved them into the bodies of the noble and all his male kin. Then he left them, still living, beside the road to die over the coming days. Over time, he would refine this gruesome method of execution until history remembered him chiefly for the brutal spectacle. Vlad the Impaler had arrived, and his enemies would suffer. Targovishta, Easter, 1457. The Wallachian boyars are feasting at Vlad Dracula's table. In their fine Easter clothes, they raise cups to their new prince. The past, they say, is forgotten. But Vlad does not forget. Suddenly, there's a commotion, and soldiers begin grabbing their arms. Vlad then separates the boyars and their families who had risen against his father and buried his brother alive, marching them out into the spring cold. The oldest are immediately impaled, while the others are force-marched down to a town below a mountain fortress and told to pick up the freshly made bricks there. They will carry the bricks up the mountain, rebuilding Vlad's new castle for the rest of their short lives. Their fine clothes tearing and falling away until they're nearly naked, and most work until they collapse and die. But who cares if the boyars perish from frostbite and exhaustion, huh? Vlad is the prince, and he can appoint new nobles. Now, if you watched the first two chapters of this video and thought, I thought this guy was called Vlad the Impaler, but he's hardly impaled anyone. Bring on the impaling! After this episode, you might regret that ask, because this part of the tale contains like a bajillion% more impalings and violence. Seriously, it's a lot. So please let this serve as a content warning for everything that follows, because this one's going to get brutal. But before we go there, I want to take a slight detour and talk about state violence during this era, since it's important to understanding Vlad, his times, and how he's remembered. The 15th century was a particularly bloody time in Europe, one where violence was commonplace in everyday life. Few laws governed warfare, and rebellions often ended with massacres or mass executions. and it was common all over Europe to keep populations in line with displays of extreme violence, as this was an era of gory public executions and torture. English kings put heads on spikes, French ones broke people on the wheel, and the Spanish had the Inquisition. In other words, public displays of cruelty were a form of political communication. We say this not to excuse law. Actually, if anything, it does the opposite, because even by these standards, his campaigns of violence were considered extreme. While we don't have a lot of primary source documents on Vlad, and things written about him or preserved orally are likely exaggerated, there is a clear theme that emerges when we look at his second reign. When he gained the throne in 1457, Vlad embarked on a planned, deliberate campaign to break the power of the Boyars, which had been on the rise since the time of his grandfather. In fact, the instability of the Wallachian throne was not all due to outside interventions by Hungary and the Ottomans. It had as much, if not more, to do with the Wallachian Boyars, who always tried to steer the weakest candidate to the throne and increase the power of their own council. Vlad, on the other hand, tended toward the aristocratic, centralized version of power that was on the rise in the Renaissance. In Vlad's mind, it would be he who controlled Wallachia, not the Boyars, and not the church. And the only way to keep the throne would be to become as powerful as possible. You can judge for yourselves, he explained in a letter to the Transylvanian town of Brasov. When a man or prince is strong and powerful, he can make peace as he wants to. But when he is weak, a strong man will come and do what he wants to him. His first act was to purge the Boyars of any deemed unfaithful or ambitious, frequently executing them via impalement. Between 1457 and 1461, he replaced all but 2 Boyars in his royal council, a body that rarely changed, even as the prince did, suggesting he likely surrounded himself with loyalists. Those loyalists came from a lower strata of the Boyar class, while others were mercenaries or followers from his exile in Transylvania, basically people that owed their elevation directly to Vlad, and who often had no previous ties or allegiances in Wallachia. And the wealth and land that Vlad gave them had, conveniently enough, been provided by their predecessors, who didn't need it. He also instituted a campaign of terror in order to enforce public order. Now, we have to be cautious when discussing this, since first-hand records about his domestic massacres are lacking, and those written by outsiders, based on reports within the country, likely include some exaggeration. But even Romanian oral traditions that are kind to him, casting him as tough but fair, still emphasize his extreme cruelty. Thieves were beheaded, unfaithful wives skinned alive, lazy peasants impaled, Roma people forced into the military or boiled alive. A Romanian folktale tells of how he threw a banquet for beggars, then locked the doors and burned the hall down to stop them burdening the state. And several accounts discuss him impaling priests who did not show him suitable respect. In another story, 2 diplomats, in some versions representatives of the Ottomans, in others Genoese Italians, once said it was against their custom to remove either their turbans or skull caps before Vlad. So, he supposedly honored this tradition by having their head coverings nailed to their skulls. And while we can't verify the truth of all these stories, they all share common elements. They portray a ruler who is trying to assert not only his own authority, but who wants to enforce a strict moral code, emphasizing hard work and deference to authority. They also suggest a tendency towards sadism, but the massacres reached a new height when it came to the Transylvanian town of Brasov, which he had rose to early in his reign, promising his protection if they agreed he could retreat there in the event of being dethroned. The relations between Vlad and Brasov got rocky fast. See, Brasov was the center of German Saxon settlement in Transylvania, and a major location for trade and manufacturing. And while it happily sent Vlad artisans, it was also under pressure from Hungary, who by this point realized Vlad was not going to be a Hungarian vassal to throw their support behind one of Vlad's relatives instead. 2 of which, just happened to be hanging around Saxon Transylvania, waiting for their moment, including Vlad's half-brother, Vlad the Monk. Because again, this series needed more guys like Vlad. Vlad kept up the dance of diplomacy with the Transylvanian Saxons for a couple of years, ordering them to expel the pretenders, and occasionally carrying out reprisals to make it happen. But by 1459, when the Saxons recognized a 3rd pretender, his patience ran out. He rounded up 41 Brasov merchants living in Wallachia and impaled them. Then he had 300 other citizens burned alive, claiming that some were spies. Then he led a 2-pronged attack into southern Transylvania, burning towns and attacking the outskirts of Brasov before withdrawing. This attack killed thousands and remains one of Vlad's most infamous acts. In retaliation, the Saxons of Brajov threw their full support behind another one of Vlad's relatives, Dan the Pretender, to make a try for the throne. And just from the fact that history remembers this guy as the Pretender, you could probably guess that did not go well. Captured after a brief battle, Dan supposedly knelt while his grave was dug in front of him. All the while, a priest conducting a burial service while the terrified man was still alive. All of which climaxed when an executioner's axe fell, dropping the Pretender's head into an open pit. 3 years into his second reign, Vlad had, through utter brutality, achieved many of his goals. He terrorized the boyars into submission or replaced them, strengthened his power, and created a spectacle of gold so incredible that both pretenders to the throne and foreign enemies along the border would think twice about trying to unseat the son of the dragon. And so he turned to foreign policy. The Ottomans. Though Vlad started his reign by paying Mehmed financial tribute, that first payment was the only one he sent. And by 1461, he was 3 years past due, and Mehmed was looking for a meeting to clear up the diplomatic frostiness. The envoys of Mehmed came in force, a Greek diplomat and a Turkish commander at their head. They had planned to capture Vlad, much like Murad had captured Vlad's father. Instead, Vlad's army came out of hiding, surrounding the Turkish force, and upon marching them back to Tartoshe, the Ottoman envoys beheld a state erected for Kochevo, with 2 higher than the others, one for the Greek diplomat and one for the Turkish commander. Within weeks, Vlad's army was across the Danube River, ravaging Turkish territory, impaling thousands of prisoners and burning civilians in their homes. Vlad was going to war against the Ottoman Empire, a clash that would prove a reunion. For leading the Turkish army against him was his childhood companion Mehmed, and at the Sultan's right hand, someone even closer to her, Vlad's own brother, Radu the Handsome. Oh boy. 1461, the Danube. Vlad Dracula would send a paper to tell his ally Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, about how many he has killed attacking Ottoman territory. 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians, not including those who were burned in their houses and whose heads were represented to other officials. But he also writes, this will lead to an all-out war with Mehmed. When the weather permits, that is to stay in the spring, they will come with evil intentions and with all of their power. And when they did, Vlad would find himself fighting alone. Vlad's attack on Ottoman territory across the Danube River didn't just come out of nowhere. He knew that his brother Radu was still on the Ottoman court, just in case Vlad needed to be replaced, and he was aware of Mehmed's expansionist designs. Indeed, it was obvious to everyone an attack was coming, because a few years earlier, Pope Paul II and the Venetians had raised money in order to fund a crusade to prevent further Ottoman expansion. But while Matthias Corvinus, Frederick III, and other rulers had taken the Pope's money, because, free money, they were slow to actually do anything productive with it. Because while most European monarchs talked a big game about defending against Muslim Turks, the reality was that for most kingdoms, their Christian neighbor states were a much more credible threat. In fact, in desperation, Pope Pius reached out to other Muslim states in hopes of convincing them to attack the Ottomans to keep Mehmed tied down. Plus, Vlad had his own border troubles, namely his cousin Stephen, who he helped put on the throne of Moldavia. But now Stephen had switched sides and became an Ottoman vassal, massing his troops on Vlad's borders so that if the Ottomans came, Vlad would have to fend off armies from 2 directions. That came to pass in 1462, when one night, Mehmed and Vlad's brother Radu led Ottoman forces across the Danube and into Wallachia. Vlad opposed him with a battery of cannons, but when the Ottomans raised their own artillery position and began firing back, he withdrew. Vlad was simply outnumbered and outgunned. Mehmed had between 60 and 70,000 troops and 120 units, whereas Vlad could only muster 10,000 soldiers in his main force, most of which peasants, rather than professionals. Now, a word of caution. While we do know what happened in this war, there's still a debate about the location, order of events, and even what Vlad and Mehmed's strategic objectives were. Mehmed, for his part, probably didn't want to outright conquer Wallachia and bring it into the empire. It was more valuable, after all, as a buffer zone against Hungary, but of course with the more dependable Radu in charge rather than Vlad. Also, he was interested in Stephen helping him take back a Black Sea fortress. Whereas Vlad, of course, wanted to stay on the throne and expel Mehmed from his place. Mehmed in the field, so instead he used guerrilla tactics. He sent word for Wallachian civilians to flee to the Carpathian Mountains, then retreated, burning the land behind him and plundering water sources to deny the Ottoman army food. Then his horsemen harried Mehmed's column, striking and disappearing, occasionally taking captives, waiting for a moment to land a hard blow, which came when the Ottoman army camped outside of the capital of Targovishta, not noticing that spies passed in their midst. According to folklore, one of those spies was in fact Vlad himself, using his command of Turkish to pass himself off as a soldier. And whether true or not, the scouts learned what they needed to know: the location of Mehmed's tent. Wallachian cavalry screamed into the unaware Ottoman force, slashing down with swords and burning canvas tents, killing hundreds in the shock assault before many in the Ottoman camp could even pick up weapons. And Vlad stormed through the melee, slicing his way into Mehmed's personal tent to find him dead. Mehmed happened to be somewhere else. Vlad called a retreat. His planned decapitation strike failed. The next day, the armies finally met in earnest, where Vlad lost 2,000 soldiers and abandoned the capital to Mehmed, running with his shattered army for the safety of the mountains. But he left something behind. As Mehmed and Radu approached Targovishta, their troops saw what from a distance looked like a stand of trees. That is, until they got closer. They were bodies. Ottoman captives from Vlad's depredations along the Danube, and the soldiers he'd snatched during the guerrilla campaign. Men, women, children, all impaled in a macabre display, with birds nesting in their corpses. One account puts the number at 20,000, roughly the amount Vlad himself had claimed to kill in his letter to Metius Corvinus. But while this terror tactic did shake the approaching Ottoman troops, it actually opened another avenue for Mehmed. He had, after all, brought his favorite Radu the Handsome to replace Vlad, and Vlad's long-standing campaigns of public cruelty and his war on the boyars had not exactly endeared him to what was left of Wallachian nobility. So with Vlad on the run, clearly defeated, boyars increasingly defected to Radu. The new prince, now enthroned at Targovishta, quickly reached out to elements Vlad had clashed with, like the Transylvanian Saxons. A great warrior he was perhaps not, but he was a cunning enough diplomat to offer himself as a more reasonable alternative to his vicious brother, even if he was an Ottoman puppet. Vlad was defeated, out of power, his troops likely deserting in increasing numbers. The only upside was that his fortress on the Black Sea had withstood a siege by both Stephen and Mehmed, but that was cold comfort. And within weeks, Vlad's support had melted to the point that Mehmed went home, leaving Radu to run things, secure on his new throne. Now hiding in the Carpathian Mountains, Vlad had but one hope. See, there was rumors that his old ally, Metius Corvinus, was marching towards Wallachia with the Hungarian army. So Vlad dispatched messages begging for aid in regaining his throne. And Corvinus came with a pair of shackles. See, Corvinus didn't necessarily want to battle Mehmed at that time, but the Pope and Venetians had, after all, given him all that nice money to fight the Ottomans with, and it just seemed like such a waste to use it fighting the Ottomans, you know? But he did have to show he'd done something. So he arrested Vlad, producing several forged letters to prove that Vlad had been collaborating with Mehmed, offering to make war on Hungary in exchange for gaining his throne. And no, it doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, even Corvinus' court historian seems to think it was a little thin. But Corvinus needed to show the Pope victory, and uncovering Vlad's treachery was a way to do that without expending military. So Vlad was a prisoner once again, and would remain one for 14 years. We have little documentation on Vlad during this period, apart from the fact that he was held for a few years and then allowed to settle in a house in Pest, transitioning from being strictly a prisoner to more of an exiled noble, forbidden from leaving the country. Though among the few stories we have about him during this time is one violent incident involving Hungarian troops. Apparently, a thief had run and hid in Vlad's home, and then when a squad of troops burst in to pursue him, Vlad had their leader executed on the spot. He'd argued, successfully, that he was within his rights because the troops had not asked for an invitation. Meanwhile, as war ensued, causing a few diplomatic incidents in Pest, Radu lost the throne to another rival. And when the news hit a clearly restless Vlad, he pushed Corvinus to give him an army to recover Wallachia. Because remember, according to Corvinus, Vlad was still the legitimate prince, and Vlad argued he could be useful. But while Corvinus still refused for years to support Vlad, he did increasingly give his pet Wallachian prince a longer and longer leash, letting him move around within Hungary and settle in Transylvania, giving him clearance to gather followers around him, staging Vlad across the border, exactly like all those pretenders had done during Vlad's rule. Corvinus was testing Dracula, seeing if he could trust him. And in 1476, the biggest test came, when he sent Vlad along on military expeditions against the Ottomans in Bosnia and to bail Vlad's cousin Stephen out when his relationship with Mehmed soured and the Sultan invaded Moldavia, though it was only a prelude. Within months, a Hungarian army was marching on Targoshta, and Vlad and Stephen, armies now united, barely missed capturing the deposed prince as he fled to Mehmed. So in November 1476, Vlad once again became the Prince of Wallachia. In his life, he'd been a hostage, a fugitive exile, a prince, a captive, a general, and both a rebel and an oppressor. He'd carried his sword for the Ottomans, Hungarians, Moldavians, a pope, and a sultan. Now in his mid-40s, it would be his third reign as prince. And though it would only last 2 months, Vlad would live forever. (1476) Constantinople. A messenger stands before Mehmed the Conqueror. He brings news of a victory against the tyrant Vlad III, who has massacred the faithful and spurned Mehmed's friendship. But the messenger didn't come alone. He carries a box, which upon its opening reveals the head of the treacherous, slain son of the dragon. Or at least that's what one story says. Because like many of the stories in this series, the accounts of how Vlad died are contradictory. We just know that 2 months into his third reign, he fought a battle with the Ottomans and lost. In fact, it's kind of ironic that given all of the excruciating detail we have about how Vlad killed his foes, we know little about his own death. But death was not the end of Vlad Dracula. Because if there's one truth about human culture, it's this. When history doesn't provide a fitting end to a historical life, legend's gonna step in to finish the job. And Dracula...
Build a bright future with continuing education at Santa Ana College. We offer free classes in English, citizenship, career, high school diploma, asset, activities, and more. You can study online or in person in the morning, evening, or weekend. Register today.
Refused to stay in the grave. Despite his relatively brief time on the throne of Wallachia, less than 7 years in total, at the time of Vlad Dracula's death, he was already casting an outsized shadow over history. For instance, do you remember back in episode 3 when we talked about the parade of cruelty and massacre during Vlad's second reign? Well, one of those incidents that might have gotten lost in the sheer cacophony of awfulness was Vlad's massacre of Transylvanian Saxons in Brașov, an act that had huge consequences. See, those Saxons were German, and while they had come to the area a couple of centuries before, they still had family and trade ties with their homeland, which in the mid to late 15th century was one of Europe's greatest centers of printing and publishing. Now, many early books and pamphlets printed in Europe essentially functioned as political and religious propaganda. And after his massacres of Saxons in Brașov, Saxon printers made Vlad a favorite villain in the printings. Meaning, as Vlad cooled his heels as a captive in Hungary, he was becoming internationally famous for cruelty and butchery, a portrayal that only escalated after his death. Now, it's important to note that many of these stories printed about Vlad were exaggerated, and a bunch likely not true at all. In fact, we've been very careful to not draw on them too much as sources, and label said sources appropriately in the rare times that we do. Because while this genre of writing was originally intended to smear one's enemies, it also became a sort of early horror literature. Even as far back as the 15th and 16th centuries, the general rule for publications was, if it bleeds, it leads. Meaning, stories of blood and guts sold well, particularly if they came along with gruesome woodblock prints. Even ostensibly serious religious books, like the 1563 publication Fox's Book of Martyrs, for instance, would get spiced up with lurid scenes of Protestants getting tortured or burned at the stake. Also, Catholic art and publications had a similar fascination with violent imagery, and the existing stories about Vlad served as a perfect jumping-off point for German authors to create stories about him doing, well, basically any twisted thing they could imagine. The Ottomans, similarly, were happy to preserve stories about Vlad's awfulness, since it justified removing him and made Hungary look bad for him. Early biographers also played a part in this mythologizing, though sometimes to Vlad's benefit. For example, a Greek biographer who appreciated Vlad's years fighting the Ottoman Empire while acknowledging Vlad's cruelty also went out of his way to try and discredit Radu. This included claims that Radu converted to Islam, which is debatable, and that he and Mehmed were actually a gay couple, a portrayal historians also find suspect since it only exists in one very anti-Ottoman source. But before you come at us, all you Mehmed Radu stans, we're not saying this wasn't a thing, just that it's not totally established fact. Ooh, but you know what is a fact? Until this very series, Rob didn't know that people actually shipped historical figures. But now he can't unknow it. Anyway, one important thing to consider is that despite all of the things said about Vlad, he was never, in any sense, accused of being a vampire. That was the work of Irish writer Bram Stoker, who ran across accounts of Vlad as he prepared to write a vampire novel that would marry Romanian folklore with 19th century technology and medical knowledge. Now exactly how much inspiration Stoker took from Vlad has been hotly debated among historians. There are those who argue that he did extensive research on Romania, its folklore, and its history. Libraries who used have discovered margin notes in books on the subject, and Jonathan Harker's journey into the Carpathian Mountains is broadly correct in its descriptions of routes, terrain, and even some local beliefs. Also in the novel, Stoker's Dracula even talks about raiding across the Danube and fighting the Ottomans in his life. But then the discovery of Stoker's notes in the 1970s turned a lot of these theories on their heads. Now, historians generally agree that Stoker knew little of Romania and essentially copied Harker's route and descriptions of the countryside from a 19th century travel guide. His descriptions of Dracula don't match Vlad at all, and he drew upon previous English vampire novels as much as Romanian folklore. His notes, in fact, don't even contain the name Vlad III. They do, however, seem very excited about the fact that several princes were from a family line called Dracula. So excited, in fact, that in his notes he actually scrawled, Dracula in Wallachian means devil, with Dracula and devil in all caps. In other words, he probably just liked the name, but didn't really know what it meant. Which actually was understandable, because by the 19th century, the word for devil and dragon had become interchangeable in Romanian. Plus, the local folklore of the time had forgotten the Order of the Dragon connection, claiming that Vlad was called Dracula or his folklore. But even though his knowledge on the references he drew from and the translation of the name of its title character is flawed, let's also try to remember that Stoker originally named his vampire Count Wampir and titled the book simply The Undead. I know, Zoe, I wouldn't watch Christopher Lee in that either. So that's how the outside world knew Vlad the Impaler. From Stoker's moderately successful novel, to blockbuster play, television and film adaptations, to Halloween costumes, games, and a whole tourism industry in Romania centered around Dracula's castle, a castle that Vlad probably never visited and that Bram Stoker never saw. But don't let that stop you from going, actually, because it's still a freaking cool castle. But that international fame is only half the story, because while everyone outside Romania saw Vlad as either a psychopath or blood-drinking Victorian monster, Romania itself had its own view. To speak very broadly, in the century after Vlad's death, Wallachia and Moldavia became Ottoman tributary states, whereas Transylvania remained independent for 2 centuries before falling under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At times, between 2 and 3 of the kingdoms shared the same monarch, drawing them closer together. Then by the 19th century, the 3 had enough of a shared sense of identity that they launched a series of simultaneous rebellions with the goal of independence. Finally, in 1878, in the aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War, Wallachia and Moldavia united to form Romania and later added Transylvania after World War I. And a core component of 19th century nationalism was drawing historical heroes out from history. And at a time when Wallachia and Moldavia were struggling for independence from Ottoman rule, Vlad the Impaler fit the mold of a hero that spoke to the present issue. In Romania, he was seen as a brutal but fair ruler who kept Wallachia independent for a time and died defending his land from greater powers. Now, if you've watched all this series, you've probably concluded that Vlad cared more about gaining and keeping personal power than any noble cause. But as is often the case with nationalistic heroes, this was ignored in favor of a story that fit more neatly with 19th century Romanian politics. the image of Vlad as an independence fighter, doing what had to be done to keep his kingdom independent from the Ottomans, just felt true at the time, and turned Vlad into a national symbol. Though to be fair, even though Vlad remains a celebrated figure in modern Romania, many Romanians continue to debate over whether the country should really be part. Who'd have thunk it? This stuff's complicated. But all of these disparate opinions of Vlad's story only serve to make it more interesting. From a life that was messy, often confusing, and of, let's just say, ambiguous loyalties, later writers have crafted Vlad into everything from a nationalist icon to horror character to folklore figure to literary vampire and debate aristocrat. Meaning, he's a fascinating study in how, if you're famous enough, one day you may end up rising from your grave to become something else entirely, which makes you want to take a good look.
It's time to style your summer staycation with Bob's Discount Furniture. Bring the fam to Bob's this Memorial Day weekend for stress-free shopping, free treats, and everyday low prices on the hottest furniture, Consumer Reports recommended mattresses, decor, and more. Oh my Bob!
Selma, Alabama, March 7th, 1965. 600 civil rights protesters, led by activists Hosea Williams and John Lewis, kneel and pray. Within moments, they'll march for the voting rights of Black Americans by crossing through the skeleton of a racist beast. The quarter-mile-long Edmund Pettus Bridge is a fitting stage for this act of defiance, as it was named for a grand dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. But as they approach the other end of the bridge, the protesters cite 150 Alabama state troopers, sheriff's deputies, and posse men. Williams steps forward, asking to speak with the commanding officer. However, the response is more of a declaration. The protesters have 2 minutes to disperse or suffer the consequences. The violence that follows will not only shame the nation, but will also serve as one of the catalysts that helps usher in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Thanks so much to Tab for Democracy for helping us tell important historical stories and encouraging everyone to exercise their right to vote. Like most race-related landmarks in the United States, the road to the Voting Rights Act was a painful part of the struggle towards equality. Only 100 years prior to the act, in 1865, the 13th Amendment freed Black Americans from chattel slavery, while the 14th Amendment granted them citizenship 3 years later. However, the reality Black Americans lived under was very different from the laws on the books. Black men encountered a plethora of obstacles on the way to the polls, especially in the southern states where members of the Ku Klux Klan used intimidation and violence to keep them from voting. See, though admitted back into the Union after losing the Civil War, most southern states did little to rectify the situation because on a local level, politicians and law enforcement were either members of the KKK or too scared to go against them. In fact, it was almost impossible to prevent the disenfranchisement of black men, while, to paraphrase Rage Against the Machine here, some of those that worked forces were the same that burnt crosses. Oh, and just to be clear why I keep saying black men, it should also be noted that no American woman of any color was allowed to vote until 1920, but we'll tackle that story another time. After the Civil War, when black men in the South gained voting rights for the first time, lynchings became a common method of terrorizing any who tried to vote. And it wasn't always one-off killings either. In the 1868 Opelousas Massacre, white Democrats in a Louisiana parish declared war on their black neighbors and their white allies, killing 250 people and eliminating the local Republican Party. In light of these outrages, President Ulysses S. Grant was compelled to take action to protect black voters. These provisions came in the form of 3 separate enforcement acts signed between 1870 and 1871. While they did not stop the racial violence, many Klansmen were finally tried in court, some with black jurors. In fact, so many Reconstruction-era racists were fined and prosecuted that the initial incarnation of the KKK was forced to disband. However, these enforcement acts would end up being challenged in court based on wording of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Lawyers exploited loopholes, and as a result, the deaths of dozens of black men went unavenged. Then, on a deadly Easter Sunday, it would all come crashing down. April 13th, 1873, Colfax, Louisiana. After hearing conflicting announcements regarding a contentious gubernatorial race, a group of white supremacists armed with rifles and a cannon arrived at a courthouse hell-bent on ensuring their candidate be certified. There, they entered a standoff with a mostly black militia guarding the building. The election had been lousy with fraud by former Confederate Democrats. From ballot stuffing to changing polling locations at the last minute to demanding to see birth certificates in full knowledge that no former slave possessed one. So with black voters outnumbering white ones and the Democrats' false victory declared by them, the black voters hunkered down and called for federal aid. However, the white supremacist militia is not here to wait or talk. They open fire. After a day-long campaign of terror, the surviving and wounded black men are forced to surrender as besiegers set the courthouse on fire. Soon after, they're hunted down or rounded up and shot execution style, their bodies buried in mass graves or thrown in the river. It's hard to say how many lost their lives, but estimates range from 62 to 153. Out of the 97 Democrats indicted for the massacre, only 9 saw the inside of the courtroom. Plus, none served jail time. As United States versus Cruikshank was elevated to the Supreme Court in 1874, where the court determined in a 5-4 decision that the federal government lacked the constitutional power to prosecute individuals who impaired rights to vote of citizens within the states. This decision essentially neutered the Enforcement Act, freed men already convicted of murdering black citizens, and gave domestic terror groups like the KKK and the White League freedom to resume their activities without fear of reprisal. Yet the final nail in the coffin came in 1877, when a disputed presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden ended in a disturbing compromise. In the deal, the Democrats conceded that their candidate Tilden had lost, but in return, the federal government pulled their troops out of the South. Hayes became president, but with no protecting black people in the southern states, the Jim Crow era was born. States like Mississippi began implementing strategies like poll taxes and literacy tests to keep blacks from the voting booths, and other southern states followed. And that remained the status quo until 1980, when the Supreme Court ruled in Gwynn versus United States that Oklahoma's literacy tests violated the 15th Amendment, a judicial win that helped establish the NAACP as a force to be reckoned with. Then, in 1944, Smith versus Allred ruled that it was a violation of the 14th and 15th Amendments for the Texas Democratic Party to disallow black Americans from voting in their primaries. The NAACP leadership considered this the door that opened the civil rights movement. Which brings us to Lyndon B. Johnson, arguably one of the most complex human beings to ever hold the office of president.
Impact confirmed. The Slayer has been activated.
Here was a man, often at odds with JFK, the progressive president he'd served under, who was a known racist that openly used the N-word even in polite settings. Yet, when JFK was killed in Dallas, Johnson used the emotional currency generated by the tragedy to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Then, when bloody scenes on the Edmund Pettus Bridge were televised before a shocked nation, Johnson used the country's collective embarrassment to double down and pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, making racial discrimination in voting illegal. In fact, one of the pens he used to sign the landmark law went to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But this about-face by Johnson caused a political schism in the Democratic Party. Southern Dixiecrats, feeling betrayed, jumped ship to the Republican Party, who had already all but abandoned the black community and their promises of racial equality. It was a monumental realignment that cemented itself when Richard Nixon made his successful play for the White House with the Southern strategy, specifically playing on white anxieties about black people in order to win the Electoral College by focusing on the South. Now, look, I think anyone who values the principles of our Constitution can agree that our country works best when our politicians have to work to win votes rather than find creative strategies to prevent people from voting. That's part of the basic framework that helps our democracy function, that it's representative and gains its legitimacy from being fairly elected by its citizens. Unfortunately, as we've seen recently, we go through cycles where civil rights laws get attacked or undermined. And when in June of 2023, the Supreme Court's ruling in Shelby County versus Holder essentially gave states the leeway to interpret the VRA however they like, it opened a dangerous door. But this is only in addition to another raft of restrictions by conservative governors on absentee ballots, stricter requirements for voter identification that disproportionately impact black and Latino voters, and reducing polling places in predominantly black districts. They've even made it a crime to offer food and water to voters waiting in long lines that result. That not to mention a long bipartisan tradition of gerrymandering districts. And then, of course, we have the 2020 election antics of Donald Trump, who sought to suppress votes in North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and other places with a number of African-American voters who will probably vote for him based around his, let's just say, attempts to suppress the votes of minorities are sadly not new. In fact, if anything, they're more consistent than the efforts to protect voting rights. Seems as soon as progress is made, ghouls come out of the woodwork to try and dismantle them with semantics and loopholes fueled at their core by racism. So we don't really have to guess what will happen if we take our eyes off the ball on this issue, because we know. And we also know where the harm will fall on the people who lose their votes, on the legitimacy of our system, and on the promises we've made to form a more perfect union. Meaning not only do we all need to vote, that is given, but we also need to ensure that voters understand our country's past so that we aren't continually doomed to repeat it. So please, take what you know and share it with others. The only way we can save our democracy is together by fostering a larger and more diverse curriculum. You know, one that's actually prepared to hold lawmakers accountable. And to that end, we are partnering with a group whose main goal is to get more people registered to vote. And the best part is, you can vote from the comfort of your own home without spending a penny. All you have to do is use our link below to install the Tab for Democracy browser extension. It works like this. Every time you open a new tab, instead of showing a blank page, it displays a customizable tab with a few tiny ads that generate money for the fantastic charity Vote America. They run large-scale voter registration and mobilization campaigns working to strengthen American democracy by removing barriers to voting. Because as we just talked about in this episode, bad actors have historically attempted to suppress far too many Americans' rights to vote in the past, and make no mistake, they will continue to do so today, which makes this kind of work that Vote America does so important. Heck, they even engage in impact litigation against states that pass voter suppression laws. They recently won lawsuits against Kansas and Georgia, which is a great step in the right direction. So if today's episode has got you fired up to help protect and expand voting rights, please join me in supporting Vote America through their Tab for Democracy campaign. So click here to install their browser extension and help raise money to protect voting rights for free. See you at the polls, everyone. I gotta tell ya, Coin, Joseph Blaine, Izzy Coin, Hunter Z, Fox Doc, Dominic Valenciana, Argalite Games, and Angelo Valenciana are just the best legendary patrons.
The future is worth fighting for, because our nation is worth believing in. Together, we answer America's call to lead. We are Marines. We were made for this.
Rome, June 30th, 1849. French shells are landing on the city as Giuseppe Garibaldi stands in front of his troops. He cuts a striking figure in his sombrero and poncho. Currently, he's commanding the defense of Rome, trying to create a unified, independent Italy. And his acts in the last month are things of legend. Smoking on the walls each morning as snipers shoot at him. Hosting dinner parties where his guests die from artillery shrapnel. But now, he addresses his troops, telling them that the political leadership has opted to surrender. Yet he himself will not. Instead, he will go to the mountains and continue to fight a guerrilla war. He then asks them to come with him, warning that he can provide no food and no rest. Instead, he offers only hunger, cold, forced marches, battles, and death. And anyone who is not satisfied with that will be left behind. But he who has the name of Italy not only on his lips, but in his heart, let him follow me. And with that offer, 4,000 of them do. For he is Garibaldi, the hero of two worlds. Possible. To see how you can become the hero of this delightfully doomed card game, stay tuned until after the episode. Giuseppe Garibaldi, the man who'd help unite Italy, was 26 years old before he'd heard of it. He was in Constantinople, sailing on his father's merchant vessel, when he heard two men talking about a secret society one had joined, called Young Italy. What do you mean, Italy? Scoffed the other. What's Italy? I mean the new Italy. The man responded, United Italy, the Italy of all Italians. Now, this answer seems obvious to us today, but it was not in Garibaldi's youth. 2 centuries ago, Italy as we know it was only the vaguest idea. People were Italian in the same way we say European now. The Italian peninsula was highly regional, carved up into small kingdoms, city-states, and republics. They had wildly differing economies, architectural styles, cultures, and even the dialects spoken were different enough that they didn't really share a common language. While the center of the peninsula was under the papacy, the other states of Italy were regional powers in flux, constantly competing with their neighbors. This made fertile ground for the larger and more powerful states that surrounded the peninsula, particularly France and Austria, to bankroll or offer protection to various states and fight proxy conflicts against their enemies. People in the Italian states were content with this situation, willingly acting as tools. After all, they generally feared domination by neighboring states far more than abdicating some power to Austria or France. But then, an Italian hero rose up to unite his country. A man who probably, more than any other, helped unite Italy, Napoleon Bonaparte? Yeah. Napoleon was born in Corsica and espoused his Corsican nationalism before deciding he'd get promoted faster if he changed his name and mannerisms to appear more French, which he was right. And in 1796, he returned to Italy at the head of a French army that conquered it, threw out the regional monarchs, and expelled the He went on to carve it up in 3 parts, ruled by various family members, achieving what was once thought impossible, uniting all of Italy into hating him. Because now, whether you were Venetian or Milanese, Florentine or Roman, you all loathe Napoleon. But then on the flip side, you hated Napoleon going away. Because despite treating Italian states like exploited colonies, he also brought a lot of modernization. From street lighting and upgraded sewers, to throwing priests out of government